The last remnants of monsoon season were pulling back from the edge of Yavapai County when Sheriff Thaddeus Pike found himself driving through the kind of night that made even 23 years of law enforcement feel insufficient. The sky held that strange, suffocating, greenish gray that follows desert storms, and through his open window came the smell of wet creosote, sharp and medicinal, mixing with the ozone-heavy air. It was 10:47 p.m., and County Road 89 stretched ahead of him like a black ribbon through scrubland that the recent rains had transformed into something alive and restless. Pike had been sheriff of Yavapai County for 11 years, long enough to know the difference between routine calls and the ones that settled wrong in your gut from the first moment. Tonight's dispatch had that quality. A 911 call reporting cries for help coming from inside a model home in the abandoned Sonoran Vista subdivision, a development that had died when the housing market collapsed in 2008. The project had been left half-finished, a grid of paved streets and concrete foundations slowly being reclaimed by the desert, and in all the years since, it had generated nothing but the occasional trespasser complaint or teenagers looking for a place to drink beer away from parental supervision. What made tonight different was the specificity of the call. The dispatcher had received it at 10:23 p.m., a male voice, breathless and urgent, saying he could hear someone screaming for help inside one of the model homes. The caller had given a precise address, 4782 Desert Bloom Drive, the Canterbury model in Phase 2. But when dispatch tried to call back for more details, the number went straight to a generic voicemail. No name, no callback. And when they ran the number through the system, it came back as a prepaid cell phone purchased 3 months ago at a Walmart in Prescott, PA, registered to nobody. Pike had sent Deputy Juniper Salazar ahead while he finished up paperwork on a domestic disturbance call in Dewey. Salazar was young, only 26, but she had good instincts and didn't spook easily. She'd radioed in 12 minutes ago to confirm she was approaching the subdivision, and since then nothing. No updates, no requests for backup, just silence. Pike had tried raising her twice on the radio with no response, which was unusual enough to accelerate his Crown Victoria from a steady cruise to something approaching urgency. The turnoff to Sonoran Vista appeared suddenly in his headlights, marked by a sun-faded sign promising desert living at its finest, beneath a logo that featured a saguaro cactus and an improbable sunset. Pike slowed and turned onto what had been meant as the development's grand entrance, a wide boulevard called Saguaro Parkway, complete with decorative streetlights that had never been connected to power. His headlights swept across the empty street, catching the white lines of parking spaces for a shopping center that existed only as a concrete slab, and beyond that, the dark shapes of the model homes rising against the night sky. The subdivision covered maybe 80 acres, laid out in a geometric pattern that looked absurd now that nature was taking it back. Creosote and Palo Verde were already pushing up through cracks in the pavement, and the monsoon rains had created temporary streams that cut across the roads, leaving behind channels of mud and debris. Pike counted 6 model homes as he drove deeper into the development, each one a different architectural style meant to appeal to different types of buyers: Spanish colonial, territorial, contemporary desert, and others whose marketing names he'd forgotten. They stood at intervals along the main road, their windows dark and empty, garage doors sealed with plywood, front yards nothing but dirt and scattered construction debris. He spotted Salazar's patrol unit parked at an angle in front of the Canterbury model, a 2-story territorial-style structure at the end of Desert Bloom Drive. Her light bar was still flashing, painting the beige stucco walls in alternating red and blue, but the driver's door stood open and the interior was empty. Pike pulled up beside her unit and killed his engine, reaching for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Sheriff Pike. I'm 10 to 23 at the Sonoran Vista subdivision. Deputy Salazar's vehicle is here, but I don't have eyes on her. requesting additional units to my location. The radio crackled back immediately. Copy that, Sheriff. Deputy Zaragoza is 15 minutes out from Cordes Lakes. Do you want me to try raising Deputy Salazar again? Negative. I'm going to locate her now. Have Zaragoza come in Code 2, no lights or sirens. Pike didn't want to announce law enforcement presence any more than Salazar's light bar already had, though he wasn't entirely sure why that instinct kicked in. Something about the scene felt staged. The open door, the running lights, the conspicuous absence of the deputy herself. He stepped out of his vehicle and immediately felt the temperature difference. The day had been hot, pushing toward 95 degrees, but the night had that desert quality of dropping fast once the sun disappeared. Maybe 70 degrees now, would probably hit 50 by dawn. The air smelled like wet earth and something else. Something faintly chemical that might have been leftover construction materials or might have been something more recent. "Salazar," Pike called out, his voice carrying across the empty development. "Deputy Salazar, it's Sheriff Pike. Call out your location." Nothing came back except the sound of water dripping somewhere nearby and the distant cry of a coyote testing the night. Pike pulled his maglite from his belt and swept the beam across the Canterbury model. The structure was bigger than the others, probably 3,500 square feet, with a covered entryway and decorative ironwork over the windows that had been meant to suggest Old West elegance. The front door stood slightly ajar. Pike approached carefully, one hand on his service weapon, the flashlight held away from his body in his left hand. Basic officer safety. Don't silhouette yourself as a target. The door opened soundlessly when he pushed it, revealing a tiled entryway that led into a great room with a 2-story ceiling. His flashlight beam caught dust motes hanging in the air and revealed walls painted in a color that might have been called desert sand or adobe clay, something meant to evoke southwestern authenticity for buyers from California and Seattle. "Salazar!" he called again, stepping inside. His boots crunched on grit and debris scattered across the tile, bits of drywall, construction paper, the small rocks that desert wind carries into every opening. The great room was empty except for a few pieces of staging furniture that someone had apparently decided weren't worth retrieving when the development failed. A couch missing its cushions, a dining table on its side, a floor lamp with no shade or bulb. Pike moved through methodically, checking the kitchen with its missing appliances and bare cabinet frames, then down a hallway that led to what would have been bedrooms. Each room was empty. Each closet contained nothing but air and that same faint chemical smell he couldn't quite place. He was climbing the stairs to the second floor when he heard it. A voice, distant and muffled, seeming to come from somewhere above or maybe behind the walls themselves. The words were indistinct, but the tone was clear. Distress, urgency, someone calling for help. Pike froze on the landing, listening. The voice came again, slightly clearer this time. "Help? Someone. Can't." The words dissolved into static or distance, he couldn't tell which. "Sheriff's Department," Pike called out. "Where are you? Call out again so I can locate you." Silence stretched for perhaps 10 seconds, long enough that Pike started to wonder if he'd imagined the voice. Then it came once more, and this time he could pinpoint the direction. Not from the second-floor rooms ahead of him, but from somewhere behind him, as if the speaker were back on the first floor, or possibly outside the house entirely. Pike descended the stairs quickly, returned to the great room, and moved toward the back of the house where sliding glass doors led to what should have been a patio. The doors were locked from the inside, their glass intact. Beyond them, his flashlight revealed a bare dirt yard and the dark shapes of the model homes on the next street over, their rear facades visible perhaps 50 yards away. The voice came again, and now it seemed to be coming from one of those other houses. Maybe the contemporary desert model or the Spanish colonial, he couldn't be certain. The sound carried strangely in the empty development, bouncing off walls and pavement in ways that made direction difficult to judge. Pike exited through the front door and stood in the street, slowly rotating as he tried to pinpoint the source. His radio crackled, and he grabbed it quickly, hoping for Salazar. "Sheriff Pike, this is dispatch. Still no response from Deputy Salazar, but I've got something weird coming up on the system. That 911 call from earlier?" The cell tower data just came through, and it's showing the phone pinged off 3 different towers in sequence: Cordis Junction, Dewey, and Mayer, all within the same 2-minute window. Pike processed this information, frowning. Those 3 towers formed a triangle that covered maybe 40 square miles of territory. For a phone to ping off all 3 in 2 minutes meant either a technical glitch or the caller had been moving at an impossible speed. "What's the timestamp on those pings?" Pike asked. 10:23:47 p.m. for Cordis Junction, 10:24:32 for Dewey, 10:25:11 for Mayer. "Sheriff, there's no way someone drove that distance in under 2 minutes. The roads don't even connect directly." Before Pike could respond, he heard footsteps, boot heels on pavement, coming from somewhere to his left. He spun, flashlight and hand moving to his weapon simultaneously, and caught a figure in his beam about 30 yards away, standing in the middle of Saguaro Parkway. It was Deputy Salazar. She stood perfectly still, arms at her sides, facing him but not moving. Even from this distance, Pike could see that something was off about her posture. Too rigid, too motionless, like someone had pressed pause on a video. "Salazar!" Pike called out, not lowering his flashlight. "Are you injured? Why didn't you respond to radio?" The deputy didn't answer. She remained frozen in place for another 3 or 4 seconds, then abruptly turned and walked away, heading deeper into the subdivision toward the area marked as Phase 3 on the development maps, the section that had never progressed beyond cleared lots and stakes with colored tape. "Salazar, stop!" Pike broke into a jog, following the beam of his flashlight as it tracked the deputy's retreating form. She didn't stop, didn't slow, just maintained that same steady pace, turning right onto a street called Mesquite Lane that curved away from the main boulevard. Pike ran faster, his equipment belt jangling, breath coming harder than he liked to admit. He rounded the corner onto Mesquite Lane and stopped short. The street ahead was empty. Salazar had vanished. The road extended maybe 200 feet before dead-ending at a concrete barricade, with empty lots on both sides and nowhere to hide except behind the barricade itself or into the desert scrub, which would make noise and leave tracks in the mud left by the recent rains. Pike approached cautiously, sweeping his light across the dirt and pavement, looking for footprints. What he found instead made him forget about the deputy for a moment. In the mud at the edge of the pavement were tracks. Boot prints, definitely. The tread pattern consistent with department-issue boots. But they were arranged in a way that made no sense. The prints led away from where he stood, heading toward the barricade as expected. But there were also prints leading back toward him, overlapping the outbound tracks in some places, as if someone had walked the same path twice. Except the inbound prints were sharper, more defined, as if they'd been made more recently than the outbound ones. Pike crouched down, studying the prints more carefully. His flashlight revealed something else. The mud around the prints was disturbed in a way that suggested water movement, as if a small stream had flowed across the area recently. But the nearest standing water from the monsoon was back near the entrance to the subdivision, and water didn't flow uphill. A sound behind him made Pike stand and turn fast. It was the voice again, the one calling for help, and now it was much closer, seeming to come from directly behind him, though no one was there. The words were clearer this time. "Help me. I can't get out. Someone please. "Where are you?" Pike called out, his voice sharper now, adrenaline making his pulse hammer. "Keep talking so I can find you." But the voice had already stopped, cut off mid-word as if someone had flipped a switch. In the silence that followed, Pike became aware of another sound, distant at first but growing closer. A vehicle engine approaching from the direction of the main entrance. His radio crackled. "Sheriff Pike, this is Deputy Zaragoza. I'm just entering the subdivision now. What's your 1020? Pike grabbed his radio, eyes still scanning the darkness around him. "I'm in Phase 3, Mesquite Lane. Zaragoza, have you seen Deputy Salazar? Is she with you?" A pause, then, "Negative, Sheriff. I haven't seen anyone. I'm coming to your location now." Pike waited, watching the glow of approaching headlights reflect off the model homes. Within a minute, Deputy Tully Zaragoza's patrol unit pulled up beside him, and the stocky, bearded deputy climbed out, his hand resting casually on his weapon. "Sheriff, what's going on? Dispatch said Deputy Salazar isn't responding." "She was here," Pike said, gesturing toward the empty street ahead. "I saw her standing right there, about 3 minutes ago. She walked toward this dead end and disappeared. No sign of her vehicle being moved, no response to radio, and I've got footprints here that don't make sense." Zaragoza pulled his own flashlight and examined the mud prints, his frown deepening as he studied them. "These look like they're going both directions at once. How does that happen?" "That's the question." Pike keyed his radio again. "Dispatch, this is Pike. I need you to try Deputy Salazar's cell phone directly, not just radio. Call it now and let me know if it connects." They waited in the darkness. 2 veteran law enforcement officers standing in an abandoned housing development, neither one willing to voice the thought that was forming in both their minds, that something was very wrong here, wrong in a way that didn't fit into any normal category of police work. The radio crackled back. "Sheriff, her cell phone is going straight to voicemail. But here's the weird thing. When I pinged it for location, it's showing at your current position. According to the cell tower, her phone is within 50 feet of where you're standing right now." Pike and Zaragoza looked at each other, then simultaneously began searching the immediate area, flashlights probing every shadow and hollow. They found nothing. No phone, no sign of Deputy Salazar, no explanation for why her cell would register as present when it clearly wasn't. "Sheriff," Zaragoza said slowly, his light fixed on something near the concrete barricade. "You need to see this." Pike joined him and found himself looking at another set of tracks. These ones appeared to be from a different type of shoe, maybe work boots or hiking boots, definitely not department issue. They led from the desert scrub on the left side of the road, approached the barricade, then seemed to double back on themselves in the same impossible way as Salazar's prints, the returning tracks sharper and more recent looking than the outbound ones. "It's like people are walking backward in time," Zaragoza muttered, then immediately shook his head as if embarrassed by the thought. Pike didn't dismiss it, though. He'd seen enough strange things in over 2 decades of law enforcement to know that sometimes the impossible explanation was just the one you hadn't figured out how to make possible yet. But that didn't mean he believed in supernatural causes. There was always a rational explanation, even if it took time to find it. "Okay," Pike said, forcing his mind into analytical mode. "Let's think this through. The mud is disturbed around the tracks, suggesting water flow. Maybe the monsoon drainage created temporary streams that partially erased and then re-exposed the prints as the water moved through. That could create the illusion of tracks appearing in reverse order." Zaragoza looked skeptical, but nodded. "Could be. But that doesn't explain where Deputy Salazar went or why her phone is pinging here when it's not actually here. Cell tower triangulation isn't perfect," Pike said, though he didn't sound convinced by his own explanation. Especially with the terrain out here, the signal could be bouncing off the model homes or that water tower over in Dewey, giving false readings. A distant sound interrupted them. The voice again, calling for help. But this time it seemed to be coming from back toward the model homes, maybe from the Canterbury where they'd started. Both deputies turned and headed back at a quick walk, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They were halfway back to the main boulevard when Pike's radio burst to life with a voice that made both of them freeze. "Sheriff Pike, this is Deputy Salazar." Her voice was calm, professional, showing no sign of distress. "I'm at the entrance to the subdivision. Did you need me to come to your location?" Pike grabbed his radio so fast he nearly dropped it. "Salazar, where the hell have you been? I've been trying to raise you for 20 minutes. I saw you here in Phase 3. You walked away from me." "Sir?" Salazar's voice carried genuine confusion. "I'm not in Phase 3. I'm at the entrance. I got here about 2 minutes ago. My radio died and I had to go back to my vehicle to get a spare battery. I was just about to drive in when I heard you on dispatch asking about me. What's going on?" Pike and Zaragoza looked at each other in the darkness, and Pike saw his own confusion reflected in the other deputy's face. If Salazar had been at the entrance for the last 20 minutes, dealing with a dead radio, then who had he seen standing on Saguaro Parkway? Who had walked away from him into Phase 3? "Salazar, I need you to stay exactly where you are," Pike said into his radio, keeping his voice steady with effort. "Don't move from that position. We're coming to you." They jogged back through the empty subdivision past the dark model homes and along Saguaro Parkway toward the entrance. Pike's mind was racing, trying to construct a rational framework for what he'd seen, but every explanation he came up with collapsed under the weight of the physical impossibility. He'd seen someone in a deputy's uniform, standing in a deputy's stance, at a distance of maybe 30 yards with his flashlight directly on them. If it hadn't been Salazar, then who? And how had they disappeared so completely on a dead-end street with no cover? They reached the entrance and found Salazar standing beside her patrol unit, exactly as she'd said, her expression concerned but showing no sign of the bizarre events Pike had just experienced. She looked solid and real in a way that made the figure he'd seen in Phase 3 seem even more dreamlike in retrospect. "Sheriff, I'm sorry about the radio," she said immediately. "The battery light was showing green, but the thing just died on me. I should have—" "Not your fault," Pike interrupted. "Tell me exactly what you did when you got here, step by step." Salazar frowned but complied. "I arrived at 10:35, checked the Canterbury model home like the dispatch call indicated, cleared the first floor, was heading upstairs when my radio died. I spent maybe 5 minutes trying to get it working, then decided to go back to my vehicle for the spare. That's when I heard dispatch asking about me, so I grabbed the spare battery, got the radio working, and called in. I've been standing here for maybe 90 seconds. You didn't walk into Phase 3? Pike pressed. You didn't stand in the middle of Saguaro Parkway? No, sir. I haven't been past the model homes. Salazar's concern was deepening into something else, worry that her sheriff might be losing it. Did you see someone who looked like me? Pike didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked back toward the Canterbury model, his flashlight sweeping the ground. The mud here was disturbed too, showing multiple sets of tracks, including ones that matched Salazar's boots. He followed them from her patrol vehicle to the front door of the model home, then back out again, exactly as she'd described. But there were other tracks too, similar but not quite identical, that led from the Canterbury to Saguaro Parkway and then toward Phase 3. Someone else was here, Pike said finally. Someone in boots similar to yours, Deputy. They went to the same place as you went, but their tracks. He trailed off, not wanting to say what he was thinking, that the tracks seemed to have been made before Salazar's in some places, and after hers in others, as if time itself had gotten confused about which footsteps came first. Zaragoza had been quiet, but now he spoke up. "Sheriff, what about that surveyor who's been working out here? Eamon Lattimore. He's been doing assessments for the county, measuring the drainage problems. He might have been here recently, might have tracks that look similar." Pike latched onto this like a lifeline. It was rational, explainable, the kind of solution police work was built on. "Good thinking. Dispatch, do you have contact information for Eamon Lattimore? I need to know if he was at Sonoran Vista today." The response came back within a minute. "Sheriff, I've got his cell. Want me to call him?" "Affirmative. Ask him if he was at the subdivision today or in the last week, and if so, what time he left." While they waited, the three deputies stood in the entrance to the failed development, their vehicles' light bars painting everything in mechanical colors that seemed wrong against the desert night. Pike found himself listening for the voice calling for help, but it had gone silent, as if whatever had been generating it had accomplished its purpose or lost interest. The radio crackled with dispatch again. "Sheriff, Lattimore says he was at the subdivision this morning, left around 1 o'clock p.m. He was doing drainage measurements in Phase 2 and 3. He also says..." The dispatcher paused. "He says he found something weird in the mud near Phase 3, boot prints that seemed to be going backward like someone had been walking in reverse. He thought maybe it was just the drainage playing tricks, water washing the mud around." Pike closed his eyes briefly. So Lattimore had seen the impossible tracks too, had tried to rationalize them the same way Pike was trying to do now. But that didn't explain what Pike had seen. A figure in a deputy's uniform, standing and walking, and then vanishing on a dead-end street. "Dispatch, ask Lattimore one more thing," Pike said. "Ask him if he heard any voices while he was here, anyone calling for help." Another pause. Longer this time. Then, "Sheriff, he says yes. He heard what sounded like someone yelling for help, coming from one of the model homes. He searched for about 20 minutes but never found anyone. He figured it was acoustics, sound carrying from the highway or from one of the nearby properties, bouncing off all the empty structures." Pike opened his eyes and looked at Salazar and Zaragoza. "We're not the first ones to experience this. Whatever's happening here has been happening since at least this morning, maybe longer." "So what do we do?" Salazar asked. That was the question, wasn't it? Pike thought. Standard procedure would be to secure the scene, call in additional resources, maybe request assistance from the state police or even the FBI if it looked like something criminal. But how did you investigate something that didn't follow physical laws? How did you write a report about footprints that existed in the wrong temporal order, and a voice that came from nowhere, and a figure that looked like your deputy, but wasn't? "We document everything," Pike said finally. "We photograph these tracks before the wind or weather changes them any further. We get statements from Lattimore about what he saw and heard. We review the 911 call recording with audio analysis, and we figure out a rational explanation, because there is always a rational explanation, even when it doesn't feel like it." But as he said those words, standing in the entrance to an abandoned subdivision that had been built on dreams and abandoned to the desert, Pike felt the certainty he'd carried for 23 years of police work beginning to crack. Because some part of him, the part that still remembered what it was like to be afraid of the dark as a child, the part that hadn't yet been educated out of him by training and experience, knew that he'd seen something impossible tonight. And that impossible thing had been wearing a deputy's uniform and walking backward through time. Sheriff Thaddeus Pike didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office at the county building in Prescott Valley, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, reviewing the photographs Deputy Zaragoza had taken of the footprints at Sonoran Vista. The images showed exactly what Pike remembered. Boot tracks that appeared to move in contradictory directions, the returning prints somehow sharper and more recent than the outbound ones, as if physics had decided to run backward for a few crucial moments. He'd labeled each photograph carefully, noting the location, the direction of travel, the depth of the impression in the mud. It was good police work, methodical and thorough, but it documented something that shouldn't exist. At 3:47 a.m., Pike gave up pretending he might rest and instead pulled the audio file of the original 911 call. He'd listened to it perhaps a dozen times already, but repetition sometimes revealed details the first hearing missed. The voice came through his computer speakers, male, breathless, urgent. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone, I can hear screaming. Someone needs help at the Sonoran Vista subdivision, the model home on Desert Bloom Drive, the Canterbury. Sir, can you tell me your name and location? There's no time. Just send someone. I can hear them screaming for help. They sound terrified. Sir, are you at the location now? Are you in danger? A pause, longer than felt natural, as if the caller were considering the question from an angle that had nothing to do with physical safety. Then, I don't know if I'm in danger. Just send someone. Please. The call ended there. Pike isolated the background sounds, turning up the volume until the static and ambient noise filled his office. Beneath the caller's voice, he could hear something else, a rhythmic sound, almost like breathing but not quite organic, more mechanical or processed. And underneath that, very faint, what might have been wind or might have been the echo of another voice, too distant to make out words. He sent the file to the county's contract audio analyst, a retired FBI technician named Sarah Voss, who lived in Sedona and did freelance work for law enforcement agencies across northern Arizona. Her email response came back within an hour, which meant she was either an insomniac like Pike, or the file had interested her enough to prioritize it. Sheriff Pike, analyzed your audio. The background noise is consistent with an enclosed space, possibly a room with hard surfaces that create reverb. The breathing-like sound is actually a recording artifact. Suggests the caller's voice might have been processed through a filter or digital modulation. Can't confirm this definitively without more samples. The secondary voice you asked about is there, but it's not contemporary with the call. It appears to be an echo or playback of the primary speaker's voice, delayed by approximately 2.3 seconds. This creates an effect where the caller is essentially responding to their own words before they speak them. I've never seen this occur naturally. Recommend follow-up on whether this call was somehow pre-recorded or digitally manipulated. Voss. Pike read the email twice, then a third time. A voice responding to itself before the words were spoken. That was impossible, unless someone had edited the audio or used some kind of delay effect. But why would someone do that? What was the purpose of creating a fake emergency call that sent deputies to an abandoned subdivision where nothing apparently waited except impossible footprints and disembodied voices? His desk phone rang, startling him out of his thoughts. The caller ID showed Yavapai County Dispatch. Pike, he answered. Sheriff, it's Martinez on the overnight desk. The dispatcher sounded uncertain, which was unusual for Elena Martinez, a 20-year veteran who Pike had always thought could handle Armageddon with the same calm efficiency she brought to lost hikers and bar fights. I just got another call about Sonoran Vista. Different caller, different number, but same basic report. Someone hearing cries for help from the model homes. Pike sat forward in his chair, fatigue forgotten. What time did the call come in? 3 minutes ago. I've got Deputy Salazar en route. She was doing patrol in Cords Junction and volunteered to respond. Tell her to wait for backup. I'm heading there now. Pike was already grabbing his keys and radio. Martinez, I need you to keep that caller on the line as long as possible. Get a name, get details, find out exactly where they are and what they're hearing. Already tried, Sheriff. They hung up after reporting it. But here's the thing. Martinez paused, and Pike could hear papers rustling. The call came from the same area code and prefix as last night's call. Different last 4 digits, but same general series. Both prepaid cells purchased from the same Walmart in Prescott. Both bought in the same transaction 3 months ago. Pike processed this as he headed for the stairs, taking them 2 at a time despite the hour and his age. Someone had bought multiple prepaid phones 3 months ago and was now using them to make sequential reports about the abandoned subdivision. That suggested planning, intention, a purpose beyond simple pranks or false alarms. Martinez, pull every 911 call we've received about Sonoran Vista in the last year. I want to know if there's a pattern we've been missing. Already on it, Sheriff. I'll have it ready when you get back. The drive to Sonoran Vista took 23 minutes through darkness that felt thicker than usual. The kind of desert night where your headlights seemed to be absorbed rather than reflected by the landscape. Pike arrived to find Salazar's patrol unit parked at the entrance, the deputy standing beside it with her flashlight sweeping the abandoned development. "Sheriff," she called out as Pike approached. "I did a preliminary walkthrough of the Canterbury model. Nobody there, no signs of disturbance, same as last night. But I heard something while I was inside, that voice calling for help. It seemed to be coming from one of the other model homes, the Spanish colonial maybe. I was waiting for backup before investigating further." Pike nodded approval. "Good. We go together this time, and we document everything we see and hear. I want a rational explanation for what's happening here, and we're not leaving until we find it." They approached the Spanish colonial model, a sprawling single-story structure with a tile roof and arched windows that gave it an incongruous elegance in the midst of the failed development. The front door stood slightly open, which Pike didn't remember from the previous night, though he acknowledged he might have missed it in the confusion of tracking the figure he'd thought was Salazar. "Did you open this?" Pike asked, gesturing at the door. "No, sir. It was like this when I arrived." They entered with flashlights drawn, Pike going first with Salazar covering from behind, a standard tactical approach that felt both necessary and absurd, given that they were searching an empty house for the source of a voice that probably didn't have a physical origin. The interior layout was different from the Canterbury. Instead of a great room, the Spanish colonial had a long central hallway with rooms branching off on either side, creating a telescoping effect that made the house seem to extend much farther than its actual footprint. They cleared the first 3 rooms, a study, a bedroom, a bathroom with missing fixtures, finding nothing but construction debris and the ubiquitous desert dust. It was in the 4th room, what would have been a master bedroom, that they found the first anomaly. Someone had been there recently. The dust on the floor was disturbed by footprints, and in the center of the room sat a folding chair that definitely hadn't been part of the original staging. On the chair lay a cell phone, its screen dark, and beside it a handwritten note on lined paper torn from a standard spiral notebook. Pike approached carefully, pulling latex gloves from his pocket before touching anything. He picked up the note and read it aloud for Salazar's benefit. "Time moves different here. You've already found this. You will find this. You are finding this. All 3 at once. The subdivision remembers what hasn't happened yet." The handwriting was neat, almost compulsively precise, each letter formed with mathematical uniformity. Pike examined the cell phone next. A cheap, prepaid model, the same brand as the ones used to make the 911 calls. When he pressed the power button, the screen lit up showing a call log with a single outgoing call made at 3:44 a.m. to Yavapai County 911. The second call, the one that had brought them back here. "Bag these as evidence," Pike told Salazar, who was already pulling out evidence bags from her duty belt. I want fingerprints on both items, and I want the phone's data extracted." "Sheriff," Salazar said quietly, her flashlight fixed on the wall behind the folding chair. "Look at this." Pike turned and felt something cold settle in his stomach. On the wall, written in what appeared to be mud or clay, were numbers, coordinates in the format used by surveyors and GPS systems. But these coordinates didn't correspond to any location in Arizona that Pike recognized. The latitude was too high, placing the location somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, and the longitude was several degrees off from any local landmark. Beneath the coordinates was another line of text, this one written in the same mud. "Phase 3 Mesquite Lane, 4:17 a.m. Be there or you already were." Pike checked his watch, 4:03 a.m. Whatever was supposed to happen at Mesquite Lane, the same dead-end street where he'd seen the impossible footprints and the figure that looked like Salazar, it was scheduled to occur in 14 minutes, or had already occurred, or was occurring now, depending on which tense the cryptic message preferred. "We're going to Phase 3, Pike said, making the decision even as part of his mind screamed that they should call for backup, should treat this like the potential trap it obviously was. But he was the sheriff, and sheriffs didn't hide from challenges, even when those challenges came wrapped in temporal paradoxes and written in mud on the walls of abandoned houses. They drove their separate vehicles through the subdivision, maintaining radio contact, their headlights cutting through darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. Pike kept expecting something to happen, a figure to appear in his path, the voice to call out again, the landscape itself to somehow shift or change. But the development remained empty and still, just failed infrastructure slowly dissolving back into the desert from which it had been temporarily extracted. At 4:14 a.m., they parked at the entrance to Mesquite Lane. Pike noted that the footprints from the previous night were still visible in the mud, though they'd been partially obscured by wind-blown sand. He and Salazar walked side by side down the dead-end street, their flashlights sweeping in synchronized arcs. At 4:17 a.m. exactly, Pike's radio erupted with a burst of static that resolved into a voice, his own voice, he realized with mounting horror, saying words he hadn't yet spoken. "Salazar, behind you. Someone's standing behind you right now." Salazar spun, her flashlight and weapon coming up together, illuminating nothing but empty air and the concrete barricade that marked the street's terminus. Pike's radio continued transmitting what sounded like a conversation between himself and Salazar, words they hadn't said but somehow felt inevitable, as if they were listening to a script they would soon be forced to perform. "Sheriff, what is that?" the radio Salazar's voice asked. "What am I looking at?" "I don't know," Radio Pike replied. "It's like the air is folding in on itself, like space is—" The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by a tone Pike recognized, the emergency broadcast system alert that preceded severe weather warnings. But instead of the standard message about flash floods or dust storms, the synthesized voice said, "Temporal anomaly detected. Causality loop established. Present moment contains echo of future event. Recommend immediate evacuation of affected area." Then silence, broken only by the desert wind and the sound of Pike's own heartbeat thundering in his ears. "Sheriff," Salazar said, and her voice was steady despite everything, which Pike found deeply reassuring. "I think we need to bring in outside help. This is beyond regular law enforcement. This is something else." Pike wanted to agree, wanted to call in the FBI or the state police or maybe some agency he'd never heard of that dealt with impossible things. But before he could respond, his flashlight beam caught something new in the mud at their feet. Fresh footprints, still wet enough that water was pooling in the depressions, forming right there as they watched, as if invisible feet were pressing down into the earth. The prince moved toward them from the barricade, a steady walking pace, getting closer with each impossible step. Pike and Salazar backed away instinctively, their flashlights following the progression of the forming prints. When the invisible walker reached a point perhaps 10 feet from where they stood, the footprints stopped appearing. But Pike could feel something there, a presence or pressure in the air, the sensation of being watched by something that existed just slightly to the left of reality. Then it spoke. Not through the radio this time, but directly into the air between them. A voice that sounded like Pike's own, but wrong somehow. The cadence off by fractions of a second. You're looking for an explanation. Linear time doesn't work here. The subdivision exists in multiple states simultaneously. What was, what is, what will be. The monsoon did something to the ground, washed away the barriers that keep moments separate. Now they bleed together. "Who are you?" Pike demanded, his service weapon drawn, though he had no idea what he was pointing it at. "I'm you," the voice replied, "from 17 minutes ahead, trying to warn you about what happens next. But I can't remember anymore if the warning creates the event or prevents it. Causality doesn't work properly here. Everything's already happened and nothing's started yet." The air in front of them seemed to shimmer, like heat distortion off summer pavement. And for just a moment, Pike saw something. A figure that might have been human, or might have been something wearing humanity like a poorly fitted suit. Its proportions wrong in subtle ways that made his eyes hurt to process. Then, Surveyor Eamon Lattimore's voice crackled over the radio, cutting through the impossible moment. "Sheriff Pike, this is Lattimore. I know it's early, but I just got home from an out-of-town job and checked my messages. You called asking about the subdivision. I need to tell you something I didn't mention before because I thought I was losing my mind. But after hearing your voicemail, I think maybe I'm not crazy. Maybe we're both seeing the same thing." "Lattimore, what is it?" Pike asked, grateful for anything resembling normal procedure, normal communication, normal anything. 3 weeks ago, I was doing preliminary surveys at Sonoran Vista. This was before the monsoon, before all the rain. I found something in one of the half-built basements in Phase 3, geological samples that didn't make sense. The rock strata were wrong. Layers that should take millions of years to form were jumbled together, limestone over granite over sandstone, all in the wrong order. I sent samples to the university in Flagstaff. Their geologist called me yesterday, said the samples show evidence of extreme temporal compression, like time itself had been subjected to intense pressure. He asked me where I'd found them. I told him at Sonoran Vista, and he laughed, said that was impossible. That kind of geological formation couldn't exist in Arizona, and definitely not in a location that was surveyed extensively before construction began. Pike's mind raced, trying to connect this information to everything else. The impossible footprints, the voices echoing from the future, the cell tower data showing phones in multiple locations simultaneously. Lattimore, can extreme temporal compression affect more than just rock? Can it affect time itself? A long pause. "Sheriff, I'm a surveyor, not a physicist. But the geologist I spoke to said if temporal compression were possible in an active sense, not just as a geological record, you'd have areas where past, present, and future exist simultaneously. You'd have causality loops, events that cause themselves, effect preceding cause. You'd have a subdivision that remembers what hasn't happened yet." Pike finished, recalling the note they'd found. "Lattimore, I need you to contact that geologist again. I need to know if there's a way to stabilize or neutralize this kind of phenomenon." "I'll try, but Sheriff, that university geologist, he died 3 weeks ago, in a car accident. on his way to Sonoran Vista, according to the police report. He was coming here to collect more samples when he lost control on Highway 89 and went off the road. They found his vehicle, but his body was never recovered. The connection clicked in Pike's mind with the weight of certainty. Another disappearance connected to the subdivision, another loose end that didn't quite resolve. How many others had there been over the years since the development was abandoned? How many people had encountered the temporal anomaly and either vanished into it or fled from it, too frightened to report what they'd experienced? Lattimore, send me everything you have on the geological samples and the geologist's analysis, and stay away from Sonoran Vista. That's an order, not a request. Already planning on it, Sheriff? Good luck. The radio fell silent, and Pike became aware that the shimmer in the air had faded, taking with it the presence of whatever had been standing invisibly in front of them. The footprints stopped forming. The subdivision settled back into ordinary darkness, ordinary abandonment, as if the past few minutes had been a temporary glitch in reality's programming. "We're leaving," Pike told Salazar. "Now, before anything else happens." They retreated to their vehicles, neither speaking about what they'd witnessed, as if putting it into words might somehow make it more real or invoke it again. Pike drove back through the subdivision faster than safety recommended, eager to put distance between himself and whatever temporal anomaly lurked in the failed development. It was only when he reached the entrance and looked back in his rearview mirror that he saw it. The Canterbury model home's windows were lit from within, warm yellow light spilling out as if someone had turned on lamps and was moving from room to room. But the subdivision had never had power connected, had never progressed beyond basic infrastructure before the money ran out. Pike grabbed his radio to call Salazar, to tell her to look back, to confirm he wasn't hallucinating. But before he could speak, all the lights in the model homes went out simultaneously, and in the darkness that followed, he could have sworn he heard his own voice, distant and distorted, calling for help from somewhere deep inside Phase 3. He drove away without looking back again, his hands gripping the steering wheel tight enough to make his knuckles ache. Behind him, Sonoran Vista settled back into abandonment, waiting patiently for the next person who would encounter its impossible geometry, its fractured timeline, its memories of events that had not yet occurred. And in the mud of Mesquite Lane, new footprints were already forming, moving backward toward a barricade they would reach yesterday. Sheriff Thaddeus Pike spent the following 3 days trying to construct a rational framework for the impossible and failing. He sat in conference rooms with state police investigators who listened politely to his account and then suggested that perhaps the stress of rural law enforcement was taking its toll. He reviewed geological surveys and historical records, searching for some precedent, some prior incident that might explain what was happening at Sonoran Vista. He found nothing that helped, and plenty that made the situation worse. The county records showed that Sonoran Vista wasn't the first failed development on that particular patch of desert. In 1987, a company called Desert Dreams LLC had attempted to build a retirement community on the same site, breaking ground on infrastructure before financial irregularities forced the project into bankruptcy. Before that, in 1952, the land had been surveyed for a military installation, some kind of communications facility, the record suggested, but the project was abruptly canceled with no explanation given. And going back further, to the late 1800s, Pike found references in territorial newspapers to the area being avoided by both settlers and the local indigenous populations, though the reasons given were vague, mentioning only that the land was troubled or unquiet. What troubled Pike most was the pattern of disappearances connected to the site. He'd requested missing persons reports for the region and found 8 cases over the past 30 years that had some connection to the Sonoran Vista area. A surveyor in 1991 who vanished while mapping property boundaries. A real estate agent in 2003 who was last seen showing the property to potential investors. A photographer in 2009 documenting abandoned developments for an art project. None of the cases had been solved, and in 6 of the 8, no bodies had ever been recovered. On the morning of the 4th day after his second visit to the subdivision, Pike received a call from Eamon Lattimore. The surveyor's voice was tight with something that might have been fear or excitement or both. "Sheriff, I got in touch with a colleague of the geologist who died, Dr. Sarah Vance at Northern Arizona University. She's been studying the samples I sent, and she wants to meet with you. She says what she's found is significant, but she won't discuss it over the phone. She's driving down from Flagstaff this afternoon and asked if you could meet her at my office around 3 p.m. Pike agreed, grateful for anything that might provide answers or at least context for what he'd experienced. He spent the hours before the meeting reviewing his notes and the photographs Salazar had taken, trying to organize the evidence into something coherent enough to present to an academic who would likely think he'd lost his mind. Lattimore's office occupied a small building on the outskirts of Prescott Valley, a converted house with the survey equipment visible through the windows. Pike arrived 10 minutes early and found the surveyor pacing in his driveway, his nervous energy evident in every movement. "Sheriff, before Dr. Vance gets here, there's something else I need to tell you." Lattimore glanced around as if worried about being overheard, though the nearest neighbor was 100 yards away. "I went back to Sonoran Vista yesterday morning. I know you told me to stay away, but I needed to collect more samples for Dr. Vance. I thought if I went during daylight, if I stayed in the developed areas and didn't go near Phase 3, it would be safe." "Was it?" Pike asked, though he already knew the answer from the tremor in Lattimore's voice. "No, I was taking core samples near the entrance when I heard something. Machinery, construction equipment, like the development was active again. I looked up and the subdivision was different. The model homes had scaffolding around them. Construction vehicles were parked on the streets, and I could see workers moving around, doing what workers do on a building site. I could hear hammers, saws, people calling to each other. It lasted maybe 30 seconds and then it just stopped. Everything went back to being abandoned. But Sheriff, those vehicles I saw? They were old models from the early 2000s. And the construction materials, the techniques, they matched what would have been used when the subdivision was first being built, before it failed." Pike felt the familiar cold weight settling in his stomach. "You saw the past. Or the past saw me. Because one of the workers, just before everything shifted back, he stopped what he was doing and stared directly at me. He looked confused, like he could see me, but I shouldn't be there. Then everything reset and he was gone." A silver Honda Civic pulled into the driveway and a woman in her 40s emerged carrying a weathered leather satchel and a laptop case. Dr. Sarah Vance had the focused intensity Pike associated with academics who'd devoted their lives to understanding specific slices of reality. She shook hands briskly with both men and suggested they move inside, away from what she called potential observation. Inside Lattimore's office, surrounded by maps and survey equipment, Dr. Vance opened her laptop and pulled up images that made Pike's head hurt to process. Microscopic photographs of rock samples showing layering that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle of view. "Sheriff Pike, Mr. Lattimore has told me about the temporal anomalies you've experienced at Sonoran Vista. I want to start by saying I believe you, which I suspect is not something you've heard from many people in the past few days." Vance's tone was matter-of-fact, clinical. The geological samples from the site show something I've only seen in one other location, a test site in Nevada where the government conducted experiments in the 1960s. Classified experiments that weren't fully declassified until 2004. What kind of experiments? Pike asked. Temporal manipulation, or more accurately, attempts at temporal manipulation that failed catastrophically. The basic theory was that space-time could be compressed or dilated through the application of certain electromagnetic frequencies in conjunction with specific geological formations. The idea was to create zones where time moved faster or slower, which had obvious military applications. Imagine being able to aid your enemies decades in moments, or creating areas where your troops could operate for hours while only seconds passed outside. Vance pulled up another image. This one, a scan of a heavily redacted government document. The experiments didn't work as intended. Instead of creating controlled temporal zones, they created what the researchers called causal fractures, areas where causes and effect became decoupled, where past, present, and future existed simultaneously. The test site had to be evacuated and sealed after several researchers disappeared or died in ways that violated basic physics. Officially, the project was shut down in 1967 and all equipment destroyed. But unofficially, Pike prompted. Unofficially, some of the researchers went into the private sector, and one of them, DeMarcus Aldridge, went to work for a defense contractor that had a subsidiary called Desert Dreams, LLC. Pike felt connections forming in his mind, pieces clicking together with the weight of terrible inevitability. The company that tried to build on the Sonoran Vista site in 1987. Exactly. I think Aldridge wanted to continue his research away from government oversight. The geological formation at Sonoran Vista is similar to the Nevada test site. Layers of limestone, granite, and sandstone in unusual configurations, combined with underground water systems that could act as conductors for electromagnetic fields. If Aldridge tried to recreate his experiments there, even on a small scale, he might have succeeded in creating another causal fracture. So, the temporal anomalies we're seeing, the voices from the future, the footprints moving backward, the overlapping timelines, those are all results of experiments from 40 years ago? Pike tried to process this, to fit it into a worldview that had never included time travel or causal fractures. Not quite. Vance's expression darkened. The experiments from the 80s would have created the initial fracture, but it should have been relatively stable, limited to a small area. What's happening now, the expanding anomalies, the increasing frequency of temporal events, suggests something is making it worse. The geological samples Lattimore collected show evidence of very recent electromagnetic activity within the last 3 months. Someone has been conducting new experiments at the site, or they've activated equipment that's been dormant for decades. Pike thought about the 911 calls, the prepaid phones purchased 3 months ago, the calculated timing of events that seemed designed to draw law enforcement into the subdivision. Someone's been testing the anomaly, learning how it works, how to use it. That would be my assessment, Vance agreed. And if they're successful in controlling or amplifying the causal fracture, the effects could spread beyond the subdivision. Temporal anomalies don't respect property boundaries. We could see the entire region destabilize, causality breaking down across thousands of square miles. Lattimore had been quiet, but now he spoke up, his voice strained. Dr. Vance, when you say someone has been conducting experiments, do you mean someone is at the subdivision right now, like physically present? Not necessarily present in a conventional sense. One of the properties of a causal fracture is that actions taken in the future can affect the past. Whoever is manipulating the anomaly might be operating from a point in time that we would consider to be days, weeks, or even years ahead of where we are now. From their perspective, all of this, she gestured at the three of them sitting in the office, has already happened. We're the past. Pike's radio crackled, startling them all. Deputy Salazar's voice came through, distorted and cutting in and out as if the signal were being disrupted. "Sheriff, need you. Sonoran Vista, someone here. They're not..." The transmission dissolved into static, then silence. Pike grabbed his radio, his pulse accelerating. "Salazar, repeat your last transmission. What's your location?" No response. Pike tried twice more, then switched to dispatch. "Martinez, do you have Deputy Salazar's 1020? The dispatcher's voice came back clear and professional. "Sheriff, Deputy Salazar is off duty today. She's not scheduled for patrol until tomorrow. Her GPS tracker shows her vehicle at her residence in Chino Valley." "Are you certain?" Pike demanded. "Positive, Sheriff. I'm looking at the tracking system right now. Her unit hasn't moved in 3 hours. Pike and Lattimore exchanged glances. Dr. Vance closed her laptop slowly, her academic detachment giving way to something more immediate and visceral. "Sheriff, I think we need to go to the subdivision, now. That radio call wasn't from your deputy in the present. It was either from the future or from a version of her that's already caught in the causal fracture." Pike was already moving toward the door, his training overriding his fear. "Lattimore, I need you to stay here. If we're not back in 2 hours, contact the state police and the FBI. Tell them everything Dr. Vance told us. Dr. Vance, you should also stay. With respect, Sheriff. I'm the only person who might understand how to navigate a causal fracture. You need me." Vance's tone left no room for argument. "Besides, I've been studying this phenomenon for 20 years. I'm not missing the chance to see it firsthand." The drive to Sonoran Vista took 17 minutes, and Pike spent them trying to raise Salazar on both radio and cell phone without success. Dr. Vance sat in the passenger seat, her laptop open, reviewing what she called theoretical navigation protocols for temporally unstable zones, which struck Pike as the kind of thing that shouldn't exist outside of science fiction novels. They arrived at the subdivision entrance to find 3 vehicles already there: Salazar's patrol unit, which shouldn't have been there at all; Eamon Lattimore's truck, which was impossible since they'd left him at his office, and a white sedan that Pike didn't recognize. All 3 vehicles were empty, doors open, engines still running as if their occupants had exited in a hurry. "This doesn't make sense," Pike said, checking Salazar's unit and finding her radio on the front seat, still transmitting a carrier signal. "How can these vehicles be here when we know their owners are somewhere else?" "They're not somewhere else," Vance said quietly, her attention fixed on something beyond the vehicles. "Look at the subdivision, Sheriff. Really look at it." Pike turned and felt reality tilt sideways. The Sonoran Vista subdivision was no longer abandoned. Lights blazed in every model home. Vehicles, modern vehicles including what looked like his own Crown Victoria, were parked along the streets. He could see people moving inside the houses, shadows passing in front of lit windows. And in the distance, near Phase 3, he could hear voices calling out, including one that sounded distressingly like his own. "It's all happening at once," Vance whispered, and there was awe in her voice alongside the fear. Every version of events, every timeline. The subdivision has become a nexus where past, present, and future are completely superimposed. Those vehicles aren't from other locations, they're from other whens. Pike's radio erupted with voices, dozens of them overlapping, all of them his own or Salazar's or Lattimore's, reporting on events that had happened, were happening, would happen. He heard himself calling for backup at a timestamp 3 days in the future. He heard Salazar reporting a body found in Phase 3 during a blizzard, though Yavapai County rarely saw snow. He heard Lattimore describing geological formations that couldn't exist, temporal strata folded in on themselves like origami. And beneath all those voices, barely audible but present, he heard someone else, a voice that sounded wrong, synthesized or processed or simply not quite human, saying words that might have been a warning or might have been an invitation. The fracture is complete. All times are one time. Come see what you will have been. Dr. Vance grabbed Pike's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. Sheriff, we need to establish a baseline. We need to anchor ourselves to a specific moment in time, or we'll get lost in the fracture. Pick a detail, something specific and unique to right now, and hold on to it. Pike looked down at his watch, 3:47 p.m., the second hand sweeping past the 12. He focused on that moment, that specific second, trying to use it as a tether to prevent himself from sliding into other weens. Okay, anchored, now what? Now we find Deputy Salazar before she becomes permanent in a timeline that isn't hers. They moved into the subdivision, walking past vehicles that flickered between being pristine and being rusted hulks, past model homes that shifted from completed to skeletal frameworks and back again. Pike could see multiple versions of the streets overlapping, paved and unpaved, wet and dry, crowded with construction workers and completely empty. The air itself seemed thick, resistant, as if they were walking through layers of time that had been compressed into the same physical space. They found Salazar standing in the middle of Saguaro Parkway, exactly where Pike had seen the figure that resembled her on his first night at the subdivision. But this time she was real, solid, and clearly terrified. She turned as they approached, her service weapon drawn, her eyes wide. "Sheriff, what's happening? I got a call about a disturbance here, and when I arrived, everything started." She struggled for words. "I can see yesterday. I can see tomorrow. I can see versions of this subdivision that never existed, and versions that haven't been built yet. How is this possible?" "Deputy, listen to me." Pike kept his voice calm, authoritative, the tone he'd used 1,000 times to talk frightened people through crisis situations. "You're experiencing a temporal anomaly. Your call didn't come from dispatch, it came from the fracture itself. You're not supposed to be here, and we need to get you out before you become trapped in a different timeline." But even as he spoke, Pike saw Salazar begin to flicker, her image doubling and tripling, showing different versions of her standing in slightly different positions, wearing different uniforms, holding different equipment. One version was decades older, gray-haired and wearing a sheriff's star. Another was younger, in street clothes, looking confused. A third was transparent, barely visible, as if that version had almost but not quite existed. "Sheriff, she's decoherence," Vance said urgently. "She's splitting across multiple timelines. We need to collapse her back into a single state, force her to exist in only one moment." "How?" Pike demanded. "Physical contact. Touch creates quantum entanglement. If you can grab her and hold on, you might be able to anchor her to your timeline, to the specific moment you're holding in your mind." Pike didn't hesitate. He moved forward and grabbed Salazar's arm, focusing on his watch reading 3:47 p.m., on that specific second, on the reality where he was Sheriff Thaddeus Pike investigating temporal anomalies on a Thursday afternoon in Yavapai County. The multiple versions of Salazar flickered more rapidly, overlapping and separating and overlapping again, and Pike felt a sensation like electric current running through his hand where he touched her. Then she solidified. Just one Salazar, breathing hard, her arm solid under his grip. "Sheriff, there were so many." "Don't think about it right now," Pike interrupted. "We need to move. We need to get back to the entrance before the fracture expands further." They started back towards the vehicles, Vance leading the way with her laptop open, reading what Pike assumed were the theoretical navigation protocols she'd mentioned. But they'd only gone 20 yards when Pike heard footsteps behind them. Not the echo of their own steps, but different footsteps, multiple sets, coming from the direction of Phase 3. He turned and saw figures emerging from the darkness where Mesquite Lane intersected with Saguaro Parkway. At first, Pike thought it was more temporal doubling, multiple versions of the same person. But as the figures came closer, he realized with mounting horror that each one was unique. They wore different clothes from different eras, some in modern gear, others in styles from decades past. Some looked solid and real, others were transparent, ghost-like. And all of them were walking with that same steady, purposeful pace toward Pike's group. "Those are the disappearances," Vance said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The people who got caught in the fracture over the years. They're trapped here, existing in all timelines simultaneously, unable to return to their original winds." The figure in front, a man in a surveyor's vest from the 1990s, stopped about 15 feet away and spoke, though his mouth didn't quite sync with the words, as if he were operating on a fractional delay from reality. "You shouldn't have come here. The fracture consumes. It integrates. Soon, you'll be like us, everywhere and every when and nowhere and never when. Time without sequence, existence without progression." Pike's hand moved to his service weapon, though he had no idea what he would shoot at or how bullets could stop something that didn't fully exist in conventional space-time. "We're leaving. Don't try to stop us." "Leaving?" The surveyor tilted his head at an angle that was wrong, too far, as if his neck had more joints than it should. "You don't understand. You've already left. You've never arrived. You're always leaving and always arriving. The fracture makes all states true." More figures emerged from Phase 3, from the model homes, from the shadows between light and dark. Pike recognized some of them from the missing persons reports he'd reviewed. The real estate agent from 2003, the photographer from 2009, others whose faces matched old photographs but whose presence here was impossible. "Dr. Vance," Pike said carefully, "I'm open to suggestions." Vance was typing rapidly on her laptop, her face illuminated by the screen's glow. "The fracture is stabilizing around us. It's trying to integrate us into its temporal matrix. I might be able to create a localized counter-frequency, something to push back against the causal breakdown, but I'd need—" A loud crack split the air, like a thunderclap but sharper, more focused. The figures from Phase 3 froze in place, and the subdivision itself seemed to shudder, reality rippling like water disturbed by a stone. Pike looked toward the source of the sound and saw a new figure standing near the contemporary desert model home. A man in his 70s wearing a suit that looked both decades old and brand new, carrying what appeared to be some kind of electronic device covered in dials and readouts. "Dr. Aldridge," Vance breathed. "That's Marcus Aldridge, the researcher from the Nevada project." The old man smiled, though the expression held no warmth. "Dr. Vance. Sheriff Pike. Deputy Salazar. I've been expecting you. Well, I've already met you, and I will meet you. Time makes simple introductions complicated, doesn't it?" "You did this," Pike said, pieces falling into place. "You created the fracture in the 80s, and you've been maintaining it, studying it. The 911 calls, the breadcrumb trail of anomalies, that was all you, drawing us here. Drawing you here, drawing you there, drawing you to when?" Aldridge moved closer, his gait steady despite his apparent age. "The Nevada project failed because we tried to control time. But I realized the secret isn't control, it's integration. Become part of the fracture, exist in all moments simultaneously, and you achieve something close to immortality. I've been alive in this subdivision since 1907, and will be alive here until 2047, and am currently alive in all the years between and beyond. The fracture isn't a trap, Sheriff. It's transcendence. Pike saw Salazar's hand moving toward her weapon and shook his head slightly. Shooting a man who existed in multiple timelines simultaneously seemed like an excellent way to make things worse. Dr. Aldridge, the fracture is expanding. If it continues, it could affect the entire region. Thousands of people could be caught in it. Millions, Aldridge corrected pleasantly. The expansion is accelerating exponentially. By next week, the fracture will encompass Prescott Valley. By next month, all of Yavapai County. By next year, well, by next year is already here, isn't it? I'm living in next year right now. And the year after, and the year after that. Dr. Vance stepped forward, her academic composure cracking. You're insane. You've created a causal cancer that will spread until it collapses the entire regional space-time continuum. Everyone caught in it will end up like those, she gestured at the frozen figures from Phase 3, trapped in temporal superposition, unable to die but unable to truly live. You say cancer, I say evolution. Aldridge held up his device. This is a temporal harmonizer, an improved version of what we used in Nevada. It doesn't just create fractures, it controls them, shapes them, directs them. I've been using it to perform experiments testing how human consciousness adapts to non-linear existence. The results have been fascinating. Would you like to see? He pressed a button on the device, and reality folded. Pike experienced the next 17 seconds from multiple angles simultaneously. He saw himself standing beside Salazar and Vance, saw himself running toward Aldridge, saw himself already having tackled the old man and wrestled away the device, saw himself failing and being absorbed into the fracture. All versions were equally real, equally immediate, and the contradiction of experiencing mutually exclusive events at the same time threatened to shred his sanity. Then Dr. Vance's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. Sheriff, focus on your anchor, the specific moment. Force yourself into one timeline. Pike grabbed onto the memory of his watch reading 3:47 p.m., that specific second, and pulled. The multiple versions of himself collapsed back into singularity with a sensation like being turned inside out and back again. He stood once more beside Vance and Salazar, his heart hammering, his mind struggling to process what he'd just experienced. Aldridge was laughing, delighted by their confusion. You see, consciousness can navigate the fracture. With practice, with training, you can learn to exist intentionally across multiple timelines. You could see every version of events, make every choice, experience every possible outcome. Why settle for one life when you can have infinite lives? Because infinite lives means no life at all, Vance shot back. You haven't achieved transcendence, Dr. Aldridge. You've achieved dissolution. You're not one person experiencing multiple timelines. You're fragments of a person scattered across time, each fragment thinking it's the original. You've destroyed yourself, and you're trying to destroy everyone else to avoid being alone in your fractured existence. Something in Aldridge's expression shifted, the confidence wavering for just a moment. In that moment, Pike saw not a mad scientist drunk on power, but a frightened old man who had made a terrible mistake decades ago and had spent the years since trying to convince himself it had been worth it. Then the moment passed, and Aldridge's smile returned. Dr. Vance, I'm offering you a gift. All of you. Integration into the fracture. No more death, no more aging, no more being trapped in a single moment's progression toward entropy. Just eternal now. Eternal here, eternal you, across all possible U's. "No," Pike said simply. "We're leaving, and we're finding a way to seal this fracture before it expands further." "You can't seal it. I won't allow it." Aldridge raised the harmonizer again. "And I don't need your permission to integrate you. The fracture responds to my commands now. I just have to—" A gunshot cracked through the subdivision, and Aldridge's chest blossomed red. He looked down at the wound with an expression of mild surprise, then looked up at Deputy Salazar, who had her service weapon extended in a two-handed grip, her face set in hard lines. "I'm not interested in transcendence," Salazar said flatly. "And I'm not going to watch you turn my sheriff into temporal fragments." Aldridge stumbled backward, dropping the harmonizer. But instead of falling, he seemed to multiply, his image splitting into dozens of versions that each reacted to the gunshot differently. Some collapsing, some staying upright, some fading away, some becoming more solid. And from each version came a different response. Voices overlapping in a grotesque chorus. "You can't kill me. I'm already dead. I haven't been born yet. I'm dying in 1987. I'm ascending in 2047. You've made me stronger. You've made me weaker. You've done nothing. You've done everything." The harmonizer lay on the pavement between them, still active, its readouts flickering through sequences of numbers that Pike's brain couldn't process. Dr. Vance lunged for it, her hands closing around the device even as the multiple versions of Aldridge reached for it, too. There was a moment of struggle, temporal images overlapping and separating, and then Vance did something to the controls that made the device emit a high-pitched whine that seemed to come from every direction at once. The fracture responded immediately. The subdivision began to shake, not physically, but temporally. Pike could see decades cycling past in moments, the development being built and abandoned and built again and falling to ruins and being reclaimed by desert in a loop that accelerated with each repetition. The figures from Phase 3 were pulled backward toward Mesquite Lane, their transparent forms fading as they were yanked deeper into whatever temporal nowhere they'd been trapped in. The multiple Aldridges collapsed back into a single version. The wounded old man now looking confused and frail, his certainty gone. "What did you do?" he whispered to Vance. "I reversed the harmonizer's polarity," she said, her voice tight with concentration as she adjusted controls. "Instead of expanding the fracture, it's now compressing it, forcing all the temporal layers to collapse back into a single coherent timeline. But that means—" Aldridge's eyes widened with realization. "That means everyone caught in the fracture will be forced back into their original timelines. The ones who came from the past will return to their pasts. The ones from the future will return to their futures. And I've existed in so many different whens that I don't have an original timeline anymore. I'll be—" He didn't finish the sentence. His form began to fade, becoming transparent, as the subdivision around them stabilized into a single version of itself. The abandoned, monsoon-damaged development Pike had first visited days ago. The lights in the model homes went out. The multiple vehicles disappeared, leaving only Pike's Crown Victoria and Vance's Honda. The voices on the radio fell silent, and Dr. Marcus Aldridge simply ceased to exist, not dying so much as being edited out of reality, removed from a timeline he'd broken himself out of decades ago. The harmonizer went dark in Vance's hands. She set it down carefully on the pavement and stood, her legs shaky. "It's done. The fracture is sealed. Anyone who was trapped in it has been returned to their proper timelines, assuming those timelines are still accessible. Some of them might have been sent to pasts that no longer exist, or futures that won't happen now. They're gone." Pike looked at Salazar, who was slowly holstering her weapon, her hands trembling. "Deputy, are you all right?" I shot a man, Sheriff. A man who might have been crazy, but he wasn't threatening us with a weapon. He was just talking. Her voice was hollow. Did I do the right thing? Before Pike could answer, Vance spoke up. You saved us, Deputy. Aldridge was going to use the harmonizer to force us into the fracture. Your action distracted him long enough for me to reverse the device. Without that distraction, we'd all be temporal fragments now, scattered across decades with no way back. Pike put a hand on Salazar's shoulder. The use of deadly force will be reviewed, as it always is. But Dr. Vance is right. You saved us, and probably saved thousands of people who would have been caught in the fracture if it had continued expanding. They stood in silence for a moment. 3 people in an abandoned subdivision trying to process what they'd just experienced and survived. Then Pike's radio crackled with a normal, blessedly normal transmission from dispatch. Sheriff Pike, this is Martinez. Just checking in. You've been off radio for about 40 minutes. Everything okay out there? Pike grabbed his radio, finding comfort in the mundane routine of responding to dispatch. Everything's fine, Martinez. Just wrapping up an investigation. We'll be back at the station within the hour. Copy that, Sheriff. Oh, and just FYI, we got another call about Sonoran Vista about 10 minutes ago. Someone reporting strange lights and voices. I told them we already had units on site investigating. Should I send anyone else out there? Pike looked at the dark, silent subdivision, then at the harmonizer lying on the pavement like evidence of a crime against physics. Negative. The situation is resolved, but I want that location marked as closed to the public. Set up barricades at the entrance tomorrow morning and get the county attorney to start condemnation proceedings. That development is permanently unsafe. Will do, Sheriff. See you back at the station. The drive back to town was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Dr. Vance sat in the back seat of Pike's Crown Victoria, the harmonizer secured in an evidence bag beside her. She'd insisted on taking it back to the university, where it could be studied and potentially used to detect other temporal anomalies before they became fractures. Sheriff, she said as they approached Prescott Valley, what are you going to put in your report? The truth? Because if you do, they'll think you're insane. Pike had been thinking about that very question. I'm going to say we responded to reports of trespassing at an abandoned development and found evidence of illegal activity, specifically unauthorized geological testing that created hazardous conditions. I'm going to recommend the site be condemned and sealed, and I'm going to file the harmonizer as evidence under seal, accessible only to authorized personnel. And the disappearances? Salazar asked from the passenger seat. The people who got trapped in the fracture? Those cases will remain open, but I suspect most of them will start closing themselves in the next few weeks. If Vance is right about people being returned to their proper timelines, we might start getting reports of those missing persons reappearing in their original time periods. A surveyor who vanished in 91 might suddenly turn up, claiming he's only been gone for an hour. A photographer who went missing in 2009 might walk into a police station tomorrow wondering what all the fuss is about. Or they might not, Vance said quietly. Some of them were in the fracture for so long their original timelines might have closed. They might have been sent to Wen spaces that no longer connect to our Wen space. They might be lost permanently in the spaces between seconds. It was not a comforting thought, but Pike had learned long ago that law enforcement wasn't about comfort. It was about doing what needed to be done and living with the consequences. They'd stopped a temporal fracture from consuming Yavapai County and potentially spreading beyond. They'd sealed a causal anomaly that had been claiming victims for 3 decades. That would have to be enough. As they pulled into the county building's parking lot, Pike's mind was already working on the paperwork, the official narrative that would explain events without invoking temporal physics or causal fractures. It would be fiction, but it would be coherent fiction, the kind that let everyone involved sleep at night without questioning the fundamental nature of reality. But he knew that somewhere in a box, in an evidence room, sealed and labeled and waiting, the temporal harmonizer would sit as proof that the impossible had happened in Yavapai County on a Thursday afternoon when the monsoon rains had washed away more than just dirt and debris. It had washed away the barriers between moments, and for a brief, terrible time, everything had existed at once. 3 weeks after the events at Sonoran Vista, Sheriff Thaddeus Pike found himself sitting in his office at 2:17 a.m., unable to sleep, staring at a case file that should have been closed but refused to stay that way. The official report had been filed, the site had been condemned, and the county had erected barricades and warning signs at every entrance to the failed development. By all accounts, the matter was resolved. But Pike knew better. The disappearances were reversing themselves, just as Dr. Vance had predicted. Martin Hastings, the surveyor who had vanished in 1991, had walked into a ranger station in Sedona, claiming he'd only been gone for a few hours, despite his family having mourned him for 32 years. Catherine Brennan, the real estate agent missing since 2003, had appeared in her own driveway, disoriented and insisting it was still 2003, only to find her children grown and her husband remarried. The photographer from 2009, Daniel Torres, had materialized in a Phoenix hospital emergency room with no memory of the intervening 14 years and wounds on his body that appeared to be both fresh and decades old simultaneously. Each return created more questions than answers. Medical examinations showed impossible results. Cellular aging that didn't match chronological age. Memories that contradicted documented history. Physical injuries that healed in reverse. The FBI had taken over most of the cases, classifying them under a designation Pike had never heard of, and quietly suggesting that local law enforcement stop asking questions that couldn't be answered through conventional investigative means. But it was the cases that hadn't reversed that kept Pike awake at night. 6 people who had disappeared near Sonoran Vista over the years remained missing, their timelines apparently too fractured to allow return. And then there was the question of Dr. Marcus Aldridge himself. Pike had requested every available record on Aldridge from the government archives, and what he'd received was a file so heavily redacted it was barely readable. What he could piece together suggested that Aldridge had been a brilliant physicist who'd worked on classified projects in the 1960s and 70s, projects with names like Kronos and Tempus that dealt with theoretical temporal mechanics. He'd left government service in 1979 under circumstances that were classified, and had resurfaced in the private sector working for defense contractors with connections to intelligence agencies. The most disturbing detail was a note buried in the file, written by a CIA oversight officer in 1982. Dr. Aldridge's work shows promising results, but raises serious concerns about long-term psychological stability. Subject demonstrates obsessive behavior regarding temporal mechanics, and has made statements suggesting he believes conventional linear time is a prison from which humanity must escape. Recommend continued surveillance and restriction of access to experimental equipment. Apparently, those recommendations had been ignored or overruled, because by 1987, Aldridge had been in Arizona, using his own money and connections to acquire the Sonoran Vista site and conduct his experiments away from federal oversight. And now he was gone, erased from a timeline he'd broken himself out of, existing nowhere and everywhere simultaneously, or perhaps not existing at all. Pike's desk phone rang, shattering the 2 a.m. silence. He grabbed it on the second ring, his law enforcement instincts making him alert despite the hour. Sheriff Pike. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, male, with an accent Pike couldn't quite place. This is Agent Carver with the Department of Defense. I'm calling about the Sonoran Vista incident. Pike sat up straighter, his exhaustion forgotten. The Department of Defense hadn't been part of any of the previous conversations about the subdivision. Agent Carver, what's your interest in Sonoran Vista? Dr. Marcus Aldridge was working under a classified contract when he created the temporal fracture in 1987. Technically, his work was still considered government property, even if he was conducting it through private channels. The harmonizer device that Dr. Vance recovered is also government property, and we need to arrange its immediate transfer to a secure facility. The harmonizer is evidence in an active investigation, Pike said carefully. It's secured at Northern Arizona University under Dr. Vance's supervision. Sheriff, I'm not asking for your cooperation. I'm informing you of what's going to happen. We have jurisdiction over anything related to Aldridge's work, and we're exercising that jurisdiction. The device will be transferred to our custody within 48 hours, and all local records of the Sonoran Vista incident will be sealed under national security protocols. Pike felt anger rising but kept his voice level. Agent Carver, people died because of Aldridge's experiments. People are still missing. You can't just classify this away and pretend it didn't happen. We're not pretending it didn't happen, Sheriff. We're ensuring it doesn't happen again, and that requires controlling access to the technology Aldridge developed. A pause. There's something else you should know. The fracture at Sonoran Vista wasn't completely sealed. Dr. Vance's reversal of the harmonizer compressed the temporal anomaly, but our readings suggest there's still a small residual effect at the site, a kind of temporal echo. Nothing dangerous at current levels, but it needs to be monitored. Monitored by whom? Pike demanded. By the same people who let Aldridge conduct unsupervised experiments for decades? By people who understand the technology better than a rural sheriff's department, with all due respect. Carver's tone suggested he meant no respect at all. The site will remain under federal oversight. Your barricades will be reinforced with our personnel, and you and your deputies will stay away from Sonoran Vista. Is that clear? Pike wanted to argue. Wanted to tell this faceless bureaucrat that Yavapai County was his jurisdiction, and he didn't take orders from federal agents who showed up after the crisis was over. But he'd been in law enforcement long enough to know when a fight was unwinnable. The federal government had resources and authority that a county sheriff couldn't match. Crystal clear, Pike said, the words tasting bitter. But I want one thing in exchange for my cooperation. You're not in a position to make demands, Sheriff. I want to know what happened to the 6 people who didn't come back, the ones whose timelines were too damaged to allow return. Do they still exist somewhere? Are they trapped in some kind of temporal limbo? Because their families deserve answers. Silence stretched for several seconds before Carver responded, and when he did, his voice had lost some of its bureaucratic edge. Honestly, Sheriff, we don't know. The physics of what Aldridge created are still theoretical. It's possible those 6 people are scattered across timelines that no longer intersect with our reality. It's possible they're experiencing time in a non-linear way, living their lives out of sequence. Or it's possible they simply ceased to exist when their timelines collapsed. We may never know. That's not good enough for their families. No, it's not. But it's all we have. Carver paused again. Sheriff, for what it's worth, you did good work at Sonoran Vista. You stopped a catastrophic expansion of the fracture and saved thousands of people from being caught in it. That won't be in any official records, and you won't get recognition for it. But it matters. You should know that. The line went dead before Pike could respond. He sat holding the silent phone, feeling the weight of unfinished business and unanswered questions. 23 years in law enforcement had taught him that cases didn't always resolve cleanly, that sometimes you had to accept partial victories and move on. But it didn't make it easier. His radio crackled to life, Deputy Salazar's voice cutting through the early morning silence. "Sheriff, are you awake? I'm at the Sonoran Vista barricade and we've got a situation." Pike was already grabbing his keys. What kind of situation? Eamon Lattimore is here. He drove around the barricade and went into the subdivision about 10 minutes ago. I tried to stop him, but he wouldn't listen. Said he needed to collect one more sample, that he'd found something in Dr. Vance's analysis that didn't make sense. Pike's blood ran cold. Did he go into Phase 3? I don't know, Sheriff. He was heading in that direction when I lost sight of him. I was about to go in after him when I thought I should call for backup first. Good thinking. Stay at the barricade and don't let anyone else through. I'm en route, ETA 12 minutes. The drive to Sonoran Vista was a blur of dark roads and racing thoughts. Pike tried to raise Lattimore on his cell phone but got no answer. He tried to convince himself that the surveyor had simply gone to collect geological samples and would emerge unharmed, but the cold certainty in his gut told him otherwise. The temporal echo that Agent Carver had mentioned. What if it was more than just a residual effect? What if the fracture was trying to reconstitute itself? He arrived at the barricade to find Salazar pacing beside her patrol unit, her flashlight cutting nervous arcs through the darkness. "Sheriff, I tried calling Lattimore, but he's not answering. And I've been hearing something from the subdivision. Voices, like before. Multiple voices overlapping, all saying the same thing." What are they saying? They're saying the echo remembers. Over and over. The echo remembers. Pike grabbed his own flashlight and radio. "Stay here. If I'm not back in 30 minutes, call the state police and the FBI. Tell them the temporal fracture at Sonoran Vista has reactivated." "Sheriff, you shouldn't go in alone. That's an order, deputy." Pike's tone left no room for argument. He'd already lost too many people to the fracture. He wasn't risking Salazar again. He climbed over the barricade and entered the subdivision, his flashlight beam cutting through darkness that felt thicker than it should, more resistant, as if the air itself was heavy with compressed time. The model homes stood silent and dark, but Pike could feel something different about them, a subtle wrongness in their proportions or positions, as if they'd shifted slightly when no one was looking. The voices Salazar had mentioned were audible now, distant and overlapping, coming from the direction of Phase 3. The echo remembers. The echo remembers. The phrase repeated with mechanical precision, and Pike realized with a chill that the voices weren't quite human. They had that same processed, synthesized quality he'd heard in the original 911 call. He found Lattimore's truck parked at the entrance to Mesquite Lane, the driver's door open and the engine still running. Survey equipment was scattered across the front seat, and Lattimore's cell phone lay on the dashboard, its screen showing a series of incoming calls from Pike and Salazar that had gone unanswered. Pike moved down Mesquite Lane toward the dead-end barricade, his flashlight revealing footprints in the dirt. Lattimore's work boots, recent and clear, heading toward Phase 3. But beside those prints were other tracks, familiar in a way that made Pike's skin crawl. They were the same impossible backward-forward tracks he'd seen 3 weeks ago, the ones that suggested time moving in contradictory directions. "Lattimore!" Pike called out, his voice swallowed by the darkness. "Eamon Lattimore, this is Sheriff Pike. Call out your location." A response came, but not from Lattimore. It was that same wrong voice, the one that sounded like Pike but wasn't, coming from somewhere ahead near the barricade. "He's here, Sheriff. He's been here. He will be here. The echo remembers everyone who touched the fracture." Pike moved forward, weapon drawn, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, to run, to get out before the subdivision could claim him too. But he was a sheriff, and a sheriff didn't abandon people in danger, even when the danger came from physics gone wrong and time eating itself. He found Lattimore standing motionless at the barricade, exactly where Pike had seen the impossible footprints during his first investigation. The surveyor's back was to Pike, and he stood perfectly still, arms at his sides, facing the empty dirt lots of Phase 3 as if watching something Pike couldn't see. "Lattimore," Pike said carefully, approaching slowly. "Are you all right? Can you hear me?" "I can hear you, Sheriff." Lattimore's voice was normal, controlled, which somehow made it worse. "I can hear you now, and I heard you 3 weeks ago, and I'll hear you tomorrow. The echo has integrated me. I exist in all the moments simultaneously now, just like Dr. Aldridge." Pike felt his chest tighten. "Eamon, you need to come with me. We need to get you out of the subdivision before what?" Lattimore turned, and Pike had to fight not to step back. The surveyor's eyes were wrong. Not physically changed, but looking in too many directions at once, as if they were trying to focus on multiple points in time simultaneously. "Before I become like the others. It's too late for that, Sheriff. I touched the fracture directly when I collected those geological samples. The temporal radiation, or whatever you want to call it. It got into my cells, my consciousness. I've been decohering for weeks. I just didn't realize it until I came back here and felt the echo calling to me. Dr. Vance said the fracture was sealed. The main fracture was sealed. But the echo remains. And the echo is hungry. It wants to reconstitute what was lost. It's calling to everyone who ever touched the temporal anomaly, trying to pull them back, trying to use them as anchors to rebuild the fracture from scratch." Lattimore took a step toward Pike, and his movement was wrong, jerky, as if different versions of him were trying to walk in slightly different directions at the same time. "It's calling to you too, Sheriff. You were inside the fracture when it collapsed. You're contaminated just like me. Can't you feel it? The pull toward multiple moments? The sensation of existing in too many whens at once." Pike did feel it. Had been feeling it for weeks, but had attributed it to stress and exhaustion. The occasional déjà vu that was too specific, too detailed. The moments when he could have sworn he'd already had a conversation that was happening for the first time. The dreams where he experienced his own life from multiple angles simultaneously, watching himself from outside while also being inside his own perspective. "The echo can't rebuild the fracture," Pike said, trying to convince himself as much as Lattimore. "Dr. Vance destroyed the harmonizer. Aldridge is gone. There's no one to control it. The echo doesn't need control. It just needs mass, temporal mass, consciousnesses that have been touched by nonlinear time. I came back to collect samples, but really I came back because the echo wanted me here. And you came here to rescue me. But really, you came because the echo wanted you too." Lattimore's smile was terrible. Too wide, involving muscles that shouldn't move that way. "We're going to be the seeds of the new fracture, Sheriff. We're going to exist in all times at once, and slowly, gradually, we'll expand until we've pulled everyone in Yavapai County into the eternal now." Pike's hand tightened on his weapon, but he knew bullets wouldn't solve this. You couldn't shoot a temporal anomaly, couldn't arrest physics gone wrong. "Eamon, listen to me. You're still you. You're still human. You can fight this. I don't want to fight it." Lattimore took another jerky step forward. "Linear time is a prison, Sheriff. Birth to death in one direction. Every moment lost as soon as it passes. But in the echo, every moment is preserved, accessible, eternal. Aldridge was right about that, even if he was wrong about everything else. This isn't dissolution, it's liberation." Pike backed away, his mind racing through options and finding none that worked. He couldn't physically restrain Lattimore without risking contact that might contaminate him further. He couldn't call for backup without endangering more deputies. And he couldn't just run, couldn't abandon the surveyor to whatever the temporal echo was doing to him. Then he remembered something Dr. Vance had said about anchoring yourself to a specific moment, using that as a tether to prevent temporal fragmentation. If he could help Lattimore find an anchor, maybe there was still a chance to pull him back from the edge of dissolution. "Amen," Pike said, forcing his voice to stay calm and authoritative. "I need you to think about a specific moment, not a general memory, but one specific second in your life, something that matters to you, something that defines who you are. Focus on that moment and hold it in your mind." Lattimore's jerky movements slowed. "What good will that do?" Dr. Vance used the technique to help Deputy Salazar resist the fracture. A specific moment can anchor your consciousness, keep you from fragmenting across multiple timelines. Try it. Pick a moment and tell me about it. For several seconds, Lattimore stood motionless, and Pike could see different expressions flickering across his face as if multiple versions of him were trying to surface simultaneously. Then something stabilized, and when the surveyor spoke again, his voice was more human, less processed. "I was 7 years old. My father took me to survey a property in the Bradshaw Mountains. It was summer, hot, and I was complaining about having to walk so far. But then we reached the survey marker and my father showed me how to use the instruments, how to take readings and translate them into maps. He told me that surveyors are the people who make sense of the land, who turn wilderness into something measurable and knowable. He said it was important work that mattered." Lattimore's eyes focused more clearly, looking at Pike rather than through him. "That was the moment I decided what I wanted to be. That was the moment that made me who I am. Hold on to that," Pike urged. "Keep that moment in your mind. Don't let the echo pull you away from it." "I'm trying, Sheriff, but it's hard. The echo is so much stronger than one memory. It has decades of time compressed into it, and I'm just one man trying to hold on to one moment." Pike's radio crackled, and Deputy Salazar's voice came through, urgent and frightened. "Sheriff, I'm seeing lights in the subdivision. The model homes are lighting up again, just like 3 weeks ago. And there are people walking on the streets, people who shouldn't be there. What's happening?" Before Pike could respond, the air around him began to shimmer with that familiar heat distortion effect. The darkness of Mesquite Lane gave way to overlapping images. The street as it was now, abandoned and deteriorating, superimposed with the street as it had been during construction, complete with workers and equipment, and the street as it would be if the development had succeeded, with finished homes and landscaping and residents. The echo was expanding, using Lattimore and possibly Pike himself as anchors to rebuild the temporal fracture. If it continued, it would spread beyond the subdivision again, and this time there would be no Dr. Vance with a harmonizer to reverse it. Pike made a decision that went against every instinct of self-preservation he'd developed in 23 years of law enforcement. He moved toward Lattimore, reaching out to grab the surveyor's arm despite knowing the risk. "Eamon, I need you to focus on that moment with your father. Hold it as tight as you can, and I'm going to anchor you to the present, to this specific moment right now. Sheriff, if you touch me while I'm fragmenting, you'll get pulled in too." "I know." Pike's hand closed around Lattimore's arm, and immediately he felt it. The sensation of existing in multiple times at once, his consciousness trying to fragment and spread across decades. But he fought it, focusing on his own anchor. His watch reading 3:47 p.m. on the day he'd first confronted the fracture, that specific second that had kept him grounded before. Around them, the temporal shimmer intensified, and Pike could see figures forming in the overlapping timelines. Construction workers from 2006, residents from timelines where the development had succeeded. the transparent shapes of people who'd been trapped in the fracture. All of them turning toward Pike and Lattimore. All of them pulled by the echo's attempt to rebuild itself. "The echo remembers," they said in unison, their voices blending into that processed inhuman chorus. "The echo preserves, the echo integrates." Pike felt his grip on linear time slipping, his consciousness starting to spread across moments like water dispersing in oil. He could see himself from multiple angles, standing beside Lattimore, running from the subdivision already having failed and been absorbed into the fracture, successfully escaping and reporting back to Salazar. All versions equally real, all pressing against his sense of self. But then he felt something else. Lattimore's memory of that moment in the Bradshaw Mountains, that 7-year-old boy learning about surveying from his father. The memory was so vivid, so specific, that it created a kind of temporal gravity, a fixed point that resisted the echo's attempt to disperse them across time. Pike latched onto it, using Lattimore's anchor to reinforce his own. "That moment made you who you are," he said, his voice sounding distant and distorted even to his own ears. "It's more real than the echo. It's more important than existing in all times at once. Hold on to it, Eamon. Don't let it go." "I'm trying, Sheriff. Lattimore's voice fractured, multiple versions of him speaking simultaneously. "I can feel the echo pulling. It wants to integrate us. It needs us to rebuild the fracture. Fight it." Pike tightened his grip on Lattimore's arm, feeling electric current running through the contact point. "You're Eamon Lattimore. You're a surveyor. You make sense of the land. You turn wilderness into something measurable and knowable. That's who you are, not some temporal fragment scattered across decades." The temporal shimmer around them began to pulse, accelerating and decelerating in rhythm with some invisible force. Pike could see the model homes flickering between different states of completion, the streets alternating between paved and unpaved, the sky shifting from night to day and back again. The echo was destabilizing, unable to fully reconstitute the fracture but unwilling to release its anchors. Then Pike heard a new sound cutting through the temporal chaos, an engine, powerful and getting closer. Headlights swept across Mesquite Lane, and a large black SUV crashed through the barricade at the end of the street, driving directly toward where Pike and Lattimore stood locked in their struggle against fragmentation. The vehicle stopped 20 feet away, and Pike saw Agent Carver emerge from the driver's seat, carrying what looked like a smaller, portable version of Aldridge's temporal harmonizer. Behind him came 2 other figures in dark suits, both carrying similar devices. "Sheriff Pike, step away from the surveyor," Carver shouted, his voice cutting through the temporal distortion. "We're going to stabilize the echo before it can fully expand." "If I let go, he'll fragment completely," Pike shouted back. "And if you don't let go, you'll both fragment. These harmonizers are calibrated to collapse the echo without destroying the people caught in it, but we need clear access." Pike looked at Lattimore, seeing the fear and hope warring in the surveyor's fragmenting expression. "Eamon, can you hold on to that memory on your own, just for a few more seconds?" "I don't know, Sheriff. It's getting harder to remember which version of me had the memory and which versions are just echoes of echoes. The version that matters is the one that's here right now, in this specific moment. That's the real you. The rest is just temporal noise." Pike prepared to release his grip. Hold on to that moment in the mountains. Make it more real than anything else. He let go and stepped back, and immediately Lattimore began to flicker more rapidly, his form doubling and tripling as different versions tried to occupy the same space. But the surveyor's face set in concentration, his lips moving as if repeating something to himself. The memory of his father, Pike guessed, that anchor moment playing on loop to keep him grounded. Carver and his team activated their harmonizers simultaneously, and the devices emitted that same high-pitched whine Pike remembered from 3 weeks ago. But this time the effect was different. Instead of collapsing all timelines into one, the harmonizers seemed to be separating them, peeling away the temporal layers that had been compressed together and forcing them back into their proper sequence. The flickering images around them began to fade. The construction workers disappearing back into 2006, the imagined residents dissolving into timelines that had never actually existed, the trapped figures from the original fracture being pulled away to whatever when spaces they'd been exiled to. The subdivision slowly stabilized back into its abandoned state. Just dark model homes and empty streets under a pre-dawn sky. Lattimore solidified, becoming a single, coherent person again, instead of a collection of overlapping temporal fragments. He collapsed to his knees, breathing hard, and Pike moved to support him. "Is he stable?" Pike asked Carver. The agent checked readings on his harmonizer before nodding. "Temporally stable, yes, but he's been exposed to significant temporal radiation. He'll need to be monitored for signs of decoherence, possibly for the rest of his life. Some people never fully recover from contact with a causal fracture." Pike helped Lattimore to his feet, supporting the surveyor's weight. "What about the echo? Is it gone?" "Contained, not gone. We can't completely eliminate temporal echoes. They're artifacts of the original fracture, and they persist even after the main anomaly is sealed. But we've compressed it down to a subcritical level. It shouldn't be able to use human consciousness as an anchor anymore." Carver gestured to his team, who began setting up additional equipment around the area. "We're establishing a permanent monitoring station here. Any future temporal fluctuations will be detected and suppressed before they can expand. You could have mentioned you had this capability when we spoke earlier," Pike said, unable to keep the edge out of his voice. "We needed to see if the echo would try to reconstitute itself before committing resources to permanent containment. Your surveyor friend provided that data by coming here tonight." Carver's expression was unreadable. "Consider it a field test that you both passed." Pike wanted to be angry, wanted to rage at the callousness of using Lattimore as bait, but exhaustion and relief won out. They'd stopped the echo from rebuilding the fracture. That was what mattered. "What happens now?" Pike asked. "Now, we take custody of the site, establish our monitoring station, and you and your department forget Sonoran Vista exists. The temporal echo will be our problem to manage." Carver paused. "And Sheriff, the contamination we detected in you, it's minor, probably won't develop into anything serious. But if you start experiencing temporal disorientation, déjà vu that's too specific, or any sense that you're existing in multiple moments simultaneously, contact us immediately. We can treat it if we catch it early." Pike drove Lattimore back to the barricade, where Deputy Salazar was waiting with medical supplies and concerned questions. Behind them, the federal team began setting up what looked like a permanent installation, complete with equipment Pike didn't recognize and warning signs that promised federal prosecution for trespassing. As the sun began to rise over Yavapai County, painting the desert in shades of orange and gold, Pike filed what he knew would be his final report on Sonoran Vista. The subdivision would become a classified federal site, its history of temporal anomalies buried under layers of bureaucracy and national security protocols. The missing persons cases would remain officially unsolved, though Pike suspected the families would eventually receive carefully worded letters explaining that their loved ones had been lost to circumstances beyond anyone's control. It wasn't the resolution Pike wanted. Too many unanswered questions, too many loose ends, too much swept under the rug by people with higher security clearances and lower accountability. But it was the resolution he was going to get. 3 months later, Pike stood in his office, preparing to leave for the day, when he noticed something odd about his desk calendar. The date showed November 17th. but he had a clear memory of that same day happening already. 2 weeks ago, he was certain. He'd worked through a domestic disturbance case and eaten lunch at the diner on Gurley Street and driven past Sonoran Vista on his way home. But when he checked his case files, there was no record of that domestic disturbance. The diner's receipts showed he hadn't eaten there in over a month. And he'd had no reason to drive past Sonoran Vista in weeks. Pike pulled out the card Agent Carver had given him, stared at the phone number for several long seconds, then put it back in his desk drawer. Maybe it was just ordinary déjà vu, the kind everyone experienced occasionally. Maybe his memory was playing tricks after the stress of the past few months. Or maybe the temporal contamination was developing, and he was beginning to experience echoes of events from other timelines, moments that had happened to other versions of himself in other whens. He decided not to think about it too hard. Some questions didn't have good answers, and some answers were worse than the questions. Sheriff Thaddeus Pike locked his office, walked to his car, and drove home through a Prescott Valley that existed firmly and solely in the present moment. Or, at least, that's what he chose to believe as he passed the turnoff to County Road 89, and didn't look toward where Sonoran Vista waited in the darkness, contained but not conquered, sealed but not silent, remembering everything that had happened, and everything that would happen, and everything that was happening in all the moments simultaneously. The echo remembers. And sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, Pike remembered too. Sheriff Rowan Kepler had driven past the old way station on Highway 191 1,000 times without giving it much thought, but tonight the place looked different in a way that made his jaw tighten. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in late October, and the temperature had dropped from the high 70s to somewhere in the low 50s, the kind of cold that settles into your bones when you're standing still in the Chiricahua foothills. The way station had been deactivated for 7 years, its scale pits filled with concrete, its office windows boarded over with plywood that had weathered to the color of old bone. But as Kepler pulled his patrol unit onto the access road, he could see light bleeding around the edges of those boards, faint and flickering like candlelight or a failing electrical connection. The call had come in 23 minutes ago from the Arizona Department of Transportation's automated monitoring system. A motion sensor that should have been disconnected when the station closed had suddenly activated, sending an alert to the state's central dispatch, who'd routed it to Cochise County Sheriff's Department because the location fell within Kepler's jurisdiction. The dispatcher, a competent woman named Rita Vasquez who'd worked the overnight shift for 12 years, had sounded puzzled when she'd relayed the information. "Sheriff, the ADOT system shows the way station is completely offline, no power, no active sensors, nothing. But the alert definitely came from that location, and it's marked as a motion detection event at 11:24 p.m. Could be a malfunction, could be someone broke in and somehow triggered old equipment." Kepler had been finishing a late dinner at the Copper Queen Diner in Bisbee when the call came through, and he'd considered sending Deputy Tully Zaragoza to check it out. But Zaragoza was handling a domestic disturbance call on the other side of the county and wouldn't be clear for at least another hour. So Kepler had headed out himself, driving north on 191 through darkness so complete it felt solid. The kind of desert night where your headlights seem to be swallowed by the landscape rather than illuminating it. Now, as he approached the way station, Kepler felt that familiar tightening in his chest that 28 years of law enforcement had taught him to respect. It wasn't fear, exactly, more like heightened awareness, the recognition that a situation might be sliding sideways into something that required more than routine procedure. He'd felt it the night he'd responded to what should have been a simple noise complaint and found a meth lab, and the night a welfare check had turned into a hostage situation, and a dozen other times when ordinary calls had revealed themselves to be anything but ordinary. The way station occupied about 2 acres of land carved out of the desert on the eastern side of Highway 191, positioned to catch commercial trucks heading north from the border crossings near Douglas. In its operational years, it had been a busy choke point where Department of Transportation officers checked vehicle weights, safety equipment, and commercial licensing. But budget cuts and changing traffic patterns had rendered it redundant in 2016, and the state had shuttered it along with 5 other similar facilities across southern Arizona. Since then, it had sat empty, occasionally visited by teenagers looking for a place to drink or transients seeking shelter, but generally ignored by everyone except the highway maintenance crews who mowed the weeds once or twice a year. Kepler parked his Crown Victoria 50 feet from the main building, leaving his light bar dark, but keeping his engine running and his radio within easy reach. The building was a single-story concrete block structure, maybe 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, painted in faded tan that matched the desert soil. To the left of the main building stood the covered scale platform where trucks had once been weighed, its metal roof supported by steel I-beams that caught the moonlight and threw angular shadows across the cracked pavement. To the right was a smaller outbuilding that had housed generators and equipment storage, its door hanging open on broken hinges. The light he'd seen from the highway was definitely real, not a trick of distance or reflection. It leaked from gaps around the boarded windows in irregular pulses, and as Kepler watched, it seemed to move from one window to another, as if someone were walking through the building carrying a light source. But there were no vehicles in the parking area except his own, no motorcycles or bicycles, no indication of how anyone might have arrived at this location that was 8 miles from the nearest town and surrounded by empty desert. Kepler grabbed his maglite and stepped out of his vehicle, the cold air hitting him like a physical presence after the warmth of his car's heater. He called out, his voice carrying across the empty station. "This is Sheriff Kepler, Cochise County. This property is closed to the public. If anyone's inside, you need to come out now with your hands visible." No response came back except the sound of wind moving through the creosote bushes and the distant rumble of a semi-truck on the highway. Kepler waited 30 seconds, then called out again. "This is your final warning. Exit the building immediately or you'll be arrested for trespassing on state property." Still nothing, but the light continued to pulse behind the boarded windows, and now Kepler could hear something else. A low, electrical hum, the kind of sound that old fluorescent lights made when their ballasts were failing. Except the way station had no power, hadn't had power for 7 years. Kepler keyed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Sheriff Kepler at the 191 way station. I've got visual confirmation of light inside the building and sounds consistent with electrical equipment running, but there are no vehicles present and no response to verbal commands. Requesting backup and contact ADOT to confirm this location is definitely without power." Rita's voice came back, professional and steady. "Copy that, Sheriff. Deputy Zaragoza is still tied up with that domestic, but I can have Deputy Martinez rolling from Wilcox, ETA approximately 40 minutes. Contacting ADOT now." 40 minutes was a long time to wait, and Kepler had a feeling that whatever was happening inside the way station might not wait that long. He approached the main building carefully, his flashlight in his left hand and his right hand resting on his service weapon. The front entrance was a metal door with a deadbolt that should have been secured, but when Kepler tried the handle, it turned smoothly, and the door swung open with barely a sound. The interior of the way station was not what Kepler expected. Instead of the empty, dusty abandonment he'd anticipated, the space looked almost operational. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh white light across a reception area that contained a metal desk, filing cabinets, and chairs that appeared to be in regular use rather than covered with 7 years of desert dust. On the desk sat a computer monitor showing what looked like a live feed from highway cameras. displaying traffic on a section of road that Kepler recognized as Highway 191, probably from a mile or two south of their current location. But the details were wrong in subtle ways that made Kepler's skin crawl. The vehicles on the monitor's feed were mostly correct: modern semi-trucks, passenger cars, the occasional RV, but interspersed among them were older models, vehicles from the early 2000s that looked too pristine to be real, as if someone had created a composite video mixing current footage with archived material. And the timestamp in the corner of the monitor showed the correct date, but the wrong time, reading 11:47 p.m. when Kepler's watch showed 11:52 p.m., a 5-minute discrepancy that shouldn't exist if this were a live feed. Kepler's radio crackled, and Rita's voice came through with an edge of confusion. "Sheriff, I've got ADOT on the line, and they're saying something strange. The way station at mile marker 112 on Highway 191 is definitely decommissioned and has no active power connection. But their remote monitoring system is showing a power draw from that location starting at approximately 11:24 p.m. tonight. They can't explain it. There's no legal connection to the grid, but the meters are registering consumption." "How much power?" Kepler asked, his eyes still fixed on the impossible monitor display. "Enough to run a full commercial facility. Lights, computers, HVAC, the works. They're sending a crew to investigate, but they won't arrive for at least 2 hours." Kepler moved deeper into the building, passing through the reception area into what had been the main operations room. Here, the wrongness intensified. Multiple computer stations lined the walls, all of them active and displaying various data feeds: weight measurements, vehicle classifications, timestamps that flickered between correct and incorrect readings. In the center of the room stood a large table covered with paperwork that looked simultaneously fresh and decades old. The ink sharp and clear, but the paper yellowed as if aged. And at one of the computer stations sat a figure in a Department of Transportation uniform, their back to Kepler, their hands moving across a keyboard with practiced efficiency. The figure appeared completely solid and real, not transparent or ghostly, but something about their posture was wrong. Too still when not typing, too mechanical when in motion, as if they were performing actions from memory rather than conscious thought. "Excuse me," Kepler said, his hand now gripping his weapon though he hadn't drawn it. "This facility is closed. You need to identify yourself and explain what you're doing here." The figure at the computer stopped typing but didn't turn around. A voice emerged, female and professionally neutral. "Way Station 1 and 12, operational status active. Processing northbound commercial traffic on Highway 191, all systems nominal. This station has been closed since 2016, Kepler said, taking a step closer. "There's no operational status here. I need you to turn around and show me some identification. Station deactivation scheduled for June 30th, 2016. The voice continued, still not turning. "Current date is October 24th, 2023. 7 years, 3 months, 24 days post-deactivation. System configuration error. Temporal database synchronization failure." Kepler felt cold spreading through his chest. "Temporal database? What are you talking about?" The figure finally turned, and Kepler had to fight the urge to step back. It was a woman in her 50s wearing a ADOT uniform with a name tag that read, "Greer Ellington, Station Supervisor." Her face was normal enough, lined with age, professional expression, eyes that met his directly. But those eyes were wrong, not in color or shape, but in the way they focused, as if they were looking at multiple layers of reality simultaneously, seeing him and through him and around him all at once. "Sheriff Kepler," she said, and her voice had that same processed quality he'd expect from a digital recording rather than a living person. "You're responding to a motion sensor alert triggered at 23:24 hours. Your arrival was predicted with 94% probability based on historical response patterns. Historical response patterns? Kepler kept his voice level, professional, despite the surreal nature of the conversation. Ma'am, I need you to explain what's happening here. Who are you, and how is this facility operating when it has no power? Greer Ellington tilted her head at an angle that was just slightly too far, as if her neck had more range of motion than it should. I am Station Supervisor Greer Ellington. I have been operating Way Station 1-12 since April 2009. This facility processes an average of 237 commercial vehicles per day, ensuring compliance with federal and state transportation regulations. The station closed 7 years ago, Kepler repeated, his hand still on his weapon. Closure protocols initiated June 30th, 2016. However, certain systems remain active for data, archival, and monitoring purposes. The recurring operations protocol was activated at 23:24 hours tonight due to detection of temporal pattern matching previous operational parameters. Kepler's radio erupted with static, and through the noise he could hear Rita's voice, distorted and cutting in and out. Sheriff, location, reading multiple, not possible. Dispatch, repeat your last transmission, you're breaking up. But instead of Rita's voice, what came through was a recording of his own voice from earlier. This is Sheriff Kepler, Cochise County. This property is closed to the public. If anyone's inside, you need to come out now with your hands visible. The recording played twice more, each time slightly different in tone and cadence, as if multiple versions of the same moment were being transmitted simultaneously. Then Rita's voice cut back in, clearer now. Sheriff, we're getting strange readings from your location. GPS shows you at the way station, but we're also picking up your transponder signal from 3 different positions within a half-mile radius. Are you mobile or stationary? I'm stationary, inside the main building, Kepler replied, though he was starting to doubt the accuracy of his own sensory input. Greer Ellington had returned to her computer station, her fingers moving across the keyboard again. Multiple position readings are consistent with temporal echo phenomenon. Sheriff's current position exists in superposition across several recent timeline iterations. This is expected behavior during recurring operations protocol activation. I don't understand what you're saying, Kepler said, frustration mixing with unease. And I need you to stop using technical jargon and explain in plain language what's happening here. The station supervisor turned again, and this time Kepler noticed something that made his blood run cold. Behind Greer, visible through the doorway leading to the back offices, he could see another figure in a DOT uniform sitting at another computer station. And beyond that figure, partially obscured by distance and angle, another and another. The building seemed to extend much farther than its exterior dimensions should allow, filled with identical or similar figures all performing the same mechanical tasks. Plain language explanation, Greer said, her wrong eyes focusing on him with uncomfortable intensity. Way Station 112 was deactivated on June 30th, 2016. However, the station's operational data, 7 years of vehicle processing, safety inspections, and traffic monitoring, created a pattern in local space-time. Think of it as a groove worn into reality by repetitive action. When certain conditions align, that groove becomes active again, and the station temporarily resumes operations. Tonight's conditions created sufficient alignment for a recurring operations event. That's not possible, Kepler said. Though, even as he spoke, he was remembering stories he'd heard from other law enforcement officers about places that didn't behave normally, locations where the rules seemed to bend in ways that couldn't be explained through conventional physics. Possibility is determined by observation, Greer replied. You are observing the station in operational status. Therefore, it is possible. Kepler's radio crackled again, and this time it was a different voice. Deputy Tully Zaragoza, who shouldn't have been available yet. Sheriff Kepler, this is Zaragoza. I'm approaching the way station from the south, ETA 3 minutes. But I'm seeing something weird on the highway. There's what looks like a temporary inspection checkpoint set up about a mile south of your position. Officers in DOT uniforms flagging down trucks. I didn't get any notice about an inspection operation tonight. Should I stop and check it out? Kepler felt pieces clicking together in his mind, forming a picture that violated common sense but matched what he was seeing. Zaragoza, what do those officers look like? Can you describe them? A pause, then, they're too far away to make out details, but their movements are strange, very mechanical, very precise, like they're following a script. And Sheriff, the trucks they're stopping, some of them look wrong. Old models that shouldn't still be on the road, mixed with current vehicles. It's like watching traffic from different years happening at the same time. Do not approach that checkpoint, Kepler ordered. Maintain your distance and wait for my signal. I think what you're seeing is connected to what's happening at the way station. Copy that, Sheriff, holding position. But you should know, the officers at that checkpoint, they're starting to look in my direction. It's like they know I'm watching them. Kepler turned back to Greer Ellington, who had been listening to the radio exchange with that same mechanical attention. Those officers at the checkpoint, are they part of your recurring operations? Affirmative. Mobile inspection teams deploy when station capacity is exceeded. Current manifestation includes primary facility plus 2 mobile checkpoint units positioned at optimal interception points on Highway 191. How long will this last? When will the station deactivate again? Recurring operations duration varies based on multiple factors. Historical pattern analysis suggests between 47 minutes and 6 hours, with median duration of approximately 2 hours and 12 minutes. However, introduction of observer variables, such as your presence and Deputy Zaragoza's surveillance of the mobile checkpoint, may extend the operational window. Kepler's mind raced through his options. He could evacuate the building and cordon off the area, waiting for the phenomenon to run its course. But if Zaragoza was right about the officers at the checkpoint becoming aware of observation, there might be risks to anyone in the vicinity. And there was still the question of what happened to any commercial trucks that got caught up in this temporal replay of the station's operations. As if reading his thoughts, Greer's wrong eyes fixed on him again. 17 commercial vehicles have been processed through the facility since recurring operations began at 23:24 hours. All inspections completed successfully. Vehicles released to continue northbound on Highway 191. I haven't seen any trucks here, Kepler said. Temporal processing occurs in accelerated state relative to observer present time. From your perspective, the processing appears instantaneous or may not be visible at all. From the vehicle's perspective, they experience standard inspection duration of 8 to 12 minutes. Kepler's radio erupted with multiple voices simultaneously. Rita from dispatch, Zaragoza from his holding position south of the way station, and a third voice that Kepler didn't recognize, speaking in a calm monotone about vehicle weights and safety compliance numbers. The voices overlapped and echoed, creating an incomprehensible cacophony that seemed to press against his eardrums like physical pressure. Then, abruptly, all the lights in the way station went out. The computer monitors went dark. The fluorescent fixtures overhead ceased their buzzing, and the electrical hum that had been a constant background noise disappeared. In the sudden darkness, Kepler's flashlight seemed pathetically inadequate, its beam cutting through blackness that felt too thick, too resistant. "Greer," Kepler called out, sweeping his light across the space where the station supervisor had been sitting. But the chair was empty, and when Kepler played his light across the room, He saw that all the computer stations were gone, the desk and filing cabinets absent. The entire space returned to the dusty, abandoned state he should have found when he first entered. The radio crackled with Rita's voice, clear and concerned. "Sheriff, we just lost all signals from your location. GPS, radio transponder. Everything went dark for about 30 seconds. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Kepler said automatically, though he wasn't sure that was true. "Did you get Deputy Zaragoza's reports about the checkpoint south of here?" "Negative, Sheriff. I haven't heard from Zaragoza in the last 15 minutes. His radio has been quiet." "He was just talking to me," Kepler said, moving back toward the entrance. "Maybe a minute ago. He said he was holding position south of the way station, observing a checkpoint with DOT officers." "Sheriff, Deputy Zaragoza cleared from his domestic disturbance call about 10 minutes ago and is currently en route to your location from Wilcox, coming from the north. He's at least 20 minutes out. He couldn't be south of you." Kepler stepped outside into the cold desert night and found his patrol unit exactly where he'd left it. Still running, still solid and normal. But when he looked back at the way station, the building was completely dark. No light leaking from the boarded windows, no sign of the impossible operations room he'd just witnessed. And when he checked his watch, he found that only 12 minutes had passed since he'd first entered the building, though it had felt like much longer. His radio crackled with a new voice, Zaragoza, sounding normal and unconcerned. "Sheriff Kepler, this is Deputy Zaragoza. I'm about 18 minutes from your location, coming south on 191. Just wanted to confirm you still need backup at the way station." "Affirmative," Kepler replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "But Zaragoza, when you get here, I need you to check something for me. About a mile south of the way station, let me know if you see any kind of checkpoint or inspection operation." "Will do, Sheriff. Though I haven't seen anything unusual on the highway so far. Just normal night traffic." Kepler stood in the cold darkness, staring at the abandoned building that had just been fully operational and staffed with impossible personnel. He thought about Greer Ellington with her wrong eyes and processed voice, about the computer monitors showing traffic from multiple time periods, about the checkpoint that Zaragoza had reported and then hadn't reported. Temporal echo, Greer had called it. A groove worn into reality by repetitive action. Kepler had been a sheriff for 11 years and had worked in law enforcement for nearly 3 decades before that. He'd seen crime scenes that tested his stomach and dealt with people who tested his faith in humanity. But he'd always been able to understand what he was seeing, even when it was terrible, because it operated according to rules he recognized. This was different. This suggested that reality itself had rules he didn't understand. Rules that allowed abandoned buildings to remember their operational past so strongly that they could temporarily become operational again. Rules that let voices transmit from times that hadn't happened yet or had already passed. His radio crackled once more, and through the static he heard a voice that might have been Greer Ellington, or might have been Rita, or might have been no one at all, saying words that made the cold seem to deepen. Recurring operations protocol remains active. Observer integration at 34%. Station memory strengthening with continued presence. Recommend evacuation before threshold activation. Kepler walked quickly back to his patrol unit, climbed inside, and pulled away from the way station faster than was probably professional. In his rearview mirror, he could see the dark building receding into the desert night, and for just a moment, he thought he saw lights flickering behind those boarded windows again. But when he looked a second time, there was only darkness. Sheriff Rowan Kepler had driven past the old way station on Highway 191 1,000 times without giving it much thought. But tonight the place looked different in a way that made his jaw tighten. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in late October, and the temperature had dropped from the high 70s to somewhere in the low 50s. the kind of cold that settles into your bones when you're standing still in the Chiricahua foothills. The way station had been deactivated for 7 years, its scale pits filled with concrete, its office windows boarded over with plywood that had weathered to the color of old bone. But as Kepler pulled his patrol unit onto the access road, he could see light bleeding around the edges of those boards, faint and flickering like candlelight or a failing electrical connection. The call had come in 23 minutes ago from the Arizona Department of Transportation's automated monitoring system. A motion sensor that should have been disconnected when the station closed had suddenly activated, sending an alert to the state's central dispatch, who'd routed it to Cochise County Sheriff's Department because the location fell within Kepler's jurisdiction. The dispatcher, a competent woman named Rita Vasquez, who'd worked the overnight shift for 12 years, had sounded puzzled when she'd relayed the information. "Sheriff, the 8-OAT system shows the way station as completely offline. No power, no active sensors, nothing. But the alert definitely came from that location, and it's marked as a motion detection event at 11:24 p.m. Could be a malfunction, could be someone broke in and somehow triggered old equipment." Kepler had been finishing a late dinner at the Copper Queen Diner in Bisbee when the call came through, and he'd considered sending Deputy Tully Zaragoza to check it out. But Zaragoza was handling a domestic disturbance call on the other side of the county, and wouldn't be clear for at least another hour. So Kepler had headed out himself, driving north on 191 through darkness so complete it felt solid. The kind of desert night where your headlights seem to be swallowed by the landscape rather than illuminating it. Now, as he approached the way station, Kepler felt that familiar tightening in his chest that 28 years of law enforcement had taught him to respect. It wasn't fear exactly, more like heightened awareness. The recognition that a situation might be sliding sideways into something that required more than routine procedure. The way station occupied about 2 acres of land carved out of the desert on the eastern side of Highway 191, positioned to catch commercial trucks heading north from the border crossings near Douglas. In its operational years, it had been a busy choke point where Department of Transportation officers checked vehicle weights, safety equipment, and commercial licensing. But budget cuts and changing traffic patterns had rendered it redundant in 2016. And the state had shuttered it along with 5 other similar facilities across southern Arizona. Since then, it had sat empty, occasionally visited by teenagers looking for a place to drink or transients seeking shelter, but generally ignored by everyone except the highway maintenance crews who mowed the weeds once or twice a year. Kepler parked his Crown Victoria 50 feet from the main building, leaving his light bar dark but keeping his engine running and his radio within easy reach. The building was a single-story concrete block structure, maybe 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, painted in faded tan that matched the desert soil. To the left of the main building stood the covered scale platform where trucks had once been weighed, its metal roof supported by steel I-beams that caught the moonlight and threw angular shadows across the cracked pavement. To the right was a smaller outbuilding that had housed generators and equipment storage, its door hanging open on broken hinges. The light he'd seen from the highway was definitely real, not a trick of distance or reflection. It leaked from gaps around the boarded windows in irregular pulses, and as Kepler watched, it seemed to move from one window to another, as if someone were walking through the building carrying a light source. But there were no vehicles in the parking area except his own, no motorcycles or bicycles, no indication of how anyone might have arrived at this location that was 8 miles from the nearest town and surrounded by empty desert. Kepler grabbed his mag light and stepped out of his vehicle, the cold air hitting him like a physical presence after the warmth of his car's heater. He called out, his voice carrying across the empty station. "This is Sheriff Kepler, Cochise County. This property is closed to the public. If anyone's inside, you need to come out now with your hands visible." No response came back, except the sound of wind moving through the creosote bushes and the distant rumble of a semi-truck on the highway. Kepler waited 30 seconds, then called out again, but the silence persisted. The light continued to pulse behind the boarded windows, and now Kepler could hear something else. A low, electrical hum, the kind of sound that old fluorescent lights made when their ballasts were failing. Except the way station had no power, hadn't had power for 7 years. Kepler keyed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Sheriff Kepler at the 191 way station. I've got visual confirmation of light inside the building, and sounds consistent with electrical equipment running, but there are no vehicles present and no response to verbal commands. Requesting backup and contact ADOT to confirm this location is definitely without power." Rita's voice came back, professional and steady. "Copy that, Sheriff. Deputy Zaragoza is still tied up with that domestic, but I can have Deputy Martinez rolling from Wilcox ETA approximately 40 minutes. Contacting ADOT now." 40 minutes was a long time to wait, and Kepler had a feeling that whatever was happening inside the way station might not wait that long. He approached the main building carefully, his flashlight in his left hand and his right hand resting on his service weapon. The front entrance was a metal door with a deadbolt that should have been secured, but when Kepler tried the handle, it turned smoothly and the door swung open with barely a sound. The interior of the way station was not what Kepler expected. Instead of the empty, dusty abandonment he'd anticipated, the space looked almost operational. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh white light across a reception area that contained a metal desk, filing cabinets, and chairs that appeared to be in regular use rather than covered with 7 years of desert dust. On the desk sat a computer monitor showing what looked like a live feed from highway cameras, displaying traffic on a section of road that Kepler recognized as Highway 191, probably from a mile or two south of their current location. But the details were wrong in subtle ways that made Kepler's skin crawl. The vehicles on the monitor's feed were mostly correct: modern semi-trucks, passenger cars, the occasional RV, but interspersed among them were older models, vehicles from the early 2000s that looked too pristine to be real, as if someone had created a composite video mixing current footage with archived material. And the timestamp in the corner of the monitor showed the correct date, but the wrong time, reading 11:47 p.m. when Kepler's watch showed 11:52 p.m., a 5-minute discrepancy that shouldn't exist if this were a live feed. Kepler's radio crackled, and Rita's voice came through with an edge of confusion. "Sheriff, I've got ADOT on the line, and they're saying something strange. The way station at mile marker 112 on Highway 191 is definitely decommissioned and has no active power connection. But their remote monitoring system is showing a power draw from that location, starting at approximately 11:24 p.m. tonight. They can't explain it. There's no legal connection to the grid, but the meters are registering consumption." "How much power?" Kepler asked, his eyes still fixed on the impossible monitor display. "Enough to run a full commercial facility. Lights, computers, HVAC, the works. They're sending a crew to investigate, but they won't arrive for at least 2 hours." Kepler moved deeper into the building, passing through the reception area into what had been the main operations room. Here, the wrongness intensified. Multiple computer stations lined the walls, all of them active and displaying various data feeds. Weight measurements, vehicle classifications, timestamps that flickered between correct and incorrect readings. In the center of the room stood a large table covered with paperwork that looked simultaneously fresh and decades old. The ink sharp and clear, but the paper yellowed as if aged. And at one of the computer stations sat a figure in a Department of Transportation uniform, their back to Kepler, their hands moving across a keyboard with practiced efficiency. The figure appeared completely solid and real, not transparent or ghostly, but something about their posture was wrong. Too still when not typing, too mechanical when in motion, as if they were performing actions from memory rather than conscious thought. "Excuse me," Kepler said, his hand now gripping his weapon though he hadn't drawn it. "This facility is closed. You need to identify yourself and explain what you're doing here." The figure at the computer stopped typing but didn't turn around. A voice emerged, female and professionally neutral. "Way Station 112, operational status active. Processing northbound commercial traffic on Highway 191. All systems nominal." "This station has been closed since 2016, Kepler said, taking a step closer. "There's no operational status here. I need you to turn around and show me some identification." "Station deactivation scheduled for June 30th, 2016. The voice continued, still not turning. "Current date is October 24th, 2023. 7 years, 3 months, 24 days post-deactivation. System configuration error. Temporal database synchronization failure." The figure finally turned, and Kepler had to fight the urge to step back. It was a woman in her 50s wearing a dhoti uniform with a name tag that read, "Greer Ellington, Station Supervisor." Her face was normal enough, lined with age, professional expression, eyes that met his directly. But those eyes were wrong, not in color or shape, but in the way they focused, as if they were looking at multiple layers of reality simultaneously, seeing him and through him and around him all at once. "Sheriff Kepler," she said, and her voice had that same processed quality he'd expect from a digital recording rather than a living person. "You're responding to a motion sensor alert triggered at 23:24 hours. Your arrival was predicted with 94% probability based on historical response patterns." Historical response patterns? Kepler kept his voice level, professional, despite the surreal nature of the conversation. "Ma'am, I need you to explain what's happening here. Who are you? And how is this facility operating when it has no power?" Greer Ellington tilted her head at an angle that was just slightly too far, as if her neck had more range of motion than it should. "I am Station Supervisor Greer Ellington. I have been operating Way Station 112 since April 2009. This facility processes an average of 237 commercial vehicles per day, ensuring compliance with federal and state transportation regulations. The station closed 7 years ago," Kepler repeated, his hand still on his weapon. "Closure protocols initiated June 30th, 2016. However, certain systems remain active for data, archival, and monitoring purposes. The recurring operations protocol was activated at 23:24 hours tonight due to detection of temporal pattern matching previous operational parameters." Kepler's radio erupted with static, and through the noise he could hear Rita's voice distorted and cutting in and out. "Sheriff, location, reading multiple, not possible." Then, instead of Rita's voice, what came through was a recording of his own voice from earlier. "This is Sheriff Kepler, Cochise County. This property is closed to the public." The recording played twice more, each time slightly different in tone, as if multiple versions of the same moment were being transmitted simultaneously. Greer Ellington had returned to her computer station, her fingers moving across the keyboard again. Multiple position readings are consistent with temporal echo phenomenon. Sheriff's current position exists in superposition across several recent timeline iterations. This is expected behavior during recurring operations protocol activation. Behind Greer, visible through the doorway leading to the back offices, Kepler could now see another figure in a DOT uniform sitting at another computer station. And beyond that figure, partially obscured by distance and angle, another, and another. The building seemed to extend much farther than its exterior dimensions should allow, filled with identical or similar figures all performing the same mechanical tasks. plain language explanation, Greer said, her wrong eyes focusing on him with uncomfortable intensity. Way Station 112 was deactivated on June 30th, 2016. However, the station's operational data, 7 years of vehicle processing, safety inspections, and traffic monitoring, created a pattern in local spacetime. Think of it as a groove worn into reality by repetitive action. When certain conditions align, that groove becomes active again, and the station temporarily resumes operations. Tonight's conditions created sufficient alignment for a recurring operations event. Kepler's radio crackled again, and this time it was a different voice. Deputy Tully Zaragoza, who shouldn't have been available yet. "Sheriff Kepler, this is Zaragoza. I'm approaching the way station from the south. ETA 3 minutes. But I'm seeing something weird on the highway. There's what looks like a temporary inspection checkpoint set up about a mile south of your position. Officers in DOT uniforms flagging down trucks. I didn't get any notice about an inspection operation tonight. Should I stop and check it out?" Kepler felt pieces clicking together in his mind. "Zaragoza, what do those officers look like? Can you describe them?" A pause, then, "They're too far away to make out details, but their movements are strange. Very mechanical, very precise. Like they're following a script, and Sheriff, the trucks they're stopping, some of them look wrong. Old models that shouldn't still be on the road, mixed with current vehicles. It's like watching traffic from different years happening at the same time." "Do not approach that checkpoint," Kepler ordered. "Maintain your distance and wait for my signal. I think what you're seeing is connected to what's happening at the way station." "Copy that, Sheriff, holding position. But you should know, the officers at that checkpoint, they're starting to look in my direction. It's like they know I'm watching them." Kepler turned back to Greer. "Those officers at the checkpoint, are they part of your recurring operations?" "Affirmative. Mobile inspection teams deploy when station capacity is exceeded. Current manifestation includes primary facility plus 2 mobile checkpoint units positioned at optimal interception points on Highway 191. How long will this last?" Recurring operations duration varies based on multiple factors. Historical pattern analysis suggests between 47 minutes and 6 hours, with median duration of approximately 2 hours and 12 minutes. However, introduction of observer variables, such as your presence and Deputy Zaragoza's surveillance of the mobile checkpoint, may extend the operational window. As if to punctuate her words, the lights in the way station flickered, and Kepler felt a sensation like static electricity crawling across his skin. Through the windows, which should have been boarded over but now appeared clear, he could see the highway, and on it he witnessed something that made his understanding of reality crack further. A semi-truck approached the way station from the south, its headlights cutting through the darkness in a way that seemed too bright, too sharp. But as the truck got closer, it seemed to flicker, its image doubling and tripling, showing the same vehicle from multiple angles or possibly multiple time periods simultaneously. The truck pulled onto the scale platform, and Kepler watched as one of the DOT officers, a man he hadn't seen before, appearing suddenly as if stepping out of thin air, approached the driver's side. Through the clear window, Kepler could hear the interaction, though it sounded distant and processed, as if he were listening to a recording played at slightly the wrong speed. "License and registration, please. We're conducting a routine safety inspection." The truck driver, or drivers, Kepler could see multiple versions of them overlapping in the cab, handed over documentation. But the papers themselves seemed wrong, flickering between different states, sometimes looking crisp and new, sometimes yellowed and aged, sometimes not existing at all. The DOT officer examined the documents with that same mechanical precision, made notes on a clipboard that appeared and disappeared in his hands, and finally nodded. Everything appears to be in order. You're cleared to proceed north. Drive safely. The truck pulled away from the scale platform, and as it did, its image began to stabilize, the multiple versions collapsing back into a single, coherent vehicle that merged smoothly with the normal traffic on Highway 191. It was as if the truck had been temporarily pulled into the way station's temporal echo and then released back into regular linear time. 17 commercial vehicles have been processed through the facility since recurring operations began at 23:24 hours, Greer said, her attention still on her computer screen. All inspections completed successfully, vehicles released to continue northbound on Highway 191. What happens to the drivers? Kepler demanded. Do they remember this? Do they know they've been pulled into some kind of temporal anomaly? Driver experience varies. Most perceive the inspection as routine and temporally consistent with their expectations. 8 to 12 minutes of standard processing. Memory integration prevents most subjects from recognizing temporal discrepancies. A small percentage, approximately 3.7%, report feelings of disorientation or lost time, but these reports are typically dismissed as fatigue or inattention. Kepler's radio crackled with Zaragoza's voice again, but this time something was wrong with the transmission. The deputy's words came through in fragments, overlapping with themselves, as if multiple versions of the same message were being sent simultaneously. Sheriff, checkpoint, officers approaching. My position. Will be. There. Zaragoza, repeat your last transmission, Kepler said urgently. What's your current status? Static filled the airwaves for several seconds. Then Zaragoza's voice came through clear but wrong, the cadence and tone subtly off. I am at checkpoint position south of Way Station. I am being processed. I was processed. I will be processed. Integration at 67%. Observer status shifting to observed. Deputy Zaragoza, get out of there now. That's a direct order. But the radio had gone silent, and when Kepler looked at Greer Ellington, he saw something that might have been concern or might have been satisfaction flicker across her too still features. Deputy Zaragoza has been integrated into the recurring operations event. His presence at the mobile checkpoint triggered observer-to-participant conversion. This is normal protocol when external law enforcement personnel interfere with active inspection operations. What does that mean? Kepler felt cold spreading through his chest. What have you done to my deputy? Deputy Zaragoza is experiencing temporal superposition. He exists in multiple states simultaneously, as observer, as subject of inspection, and as integrated component of the checkpoint operation. Resolution will occur when recurring operations conclude, at which point he will revert to his primary timeline with memory integration preventing conscious recall of the event. Kepler pulled his service weapon, training it on Greer, even as part of his mind screamed that pointing a gun at what might be a temporal echo or a living memory of a closed facility was futile. I want my deputy back. I want this, whatever this is, to stop now. Greer turned to face him fully, and her wrong eyes seemed to multiply, as if he were looking at dozens of versions of her all occupying the same space. Sheriff Kepler, use of force will not achieve desired outcome. I am not a physical entity that can be threatened or harmed. I am operational memory made manifest, the collective pattern of 2,847 days of way station activities compressed into recurring event structure. You cannot shoot a memory. Then, how do I stop this? Recurring operations will conclude when temporal alignment conditions deteriorate below sustainability threshold. Your intervention options are limited. You can wait for natural conclusion, estimated at 74 to 136 minutes from current moment. Or you can attempt to disrupt the pattern by introducing significant deviation from historical operational parameters. Kepler lowered his weapon slightly, his mind racing through possibilities. What kind of deviation? Historical data shows way station operations followed consistent protocols. Vehicle processing, safety inspections, weight measurements, all conducted according to established procedures. Significant deviation would require action that falls outside these parameters. Action that has no precedent in the station's operational history. An idea formed in Kepler's mind, dangerous and possibly futile, but the only option he could see. The station's operational history doesn't include a sheriff setting fire to the facility. That would be a significant deviation. For the first time, Greer's mechanical precision faltered. Her head tilted at that wrong angle again, and when she spoke, her voice carried multiple tones simultaneously, as if several versions of her were trying to respond at once. Fire suppression protocols activate. Historical data contains no fire events. Introduction of combustion would constitute critical deviation from established patterns. Calculating consequences, unable to predict outcome. Temporal stability at risk. Kepler didn't wait for her to finish calculating. He moved quickly back through the operations room into the reception area, searching for anything flammable. The filing cabinets contained paperwork that flickered between solid and insubstantial, and when Kepler tried to grab a handful of documents, they dissolved into something like smoke in his hands. But in a corner of the room, he found what he needed: a maintenance closet containing cleaning supplies, including several bottles of industrial solvent that were solid, real, existing in the present moment rather than in the station's temporal echo. He grabbed 2 bottles and moved back into the operations room, where Greer still sat at her computer station, her fingers frozen over the keyboard. Her wrong eyes fixed on him with an expression that might have been fear or might have been anticipation. Sheriff Kepler, this action will create unpredictable temporal disruption. Recurring operations may collapse in non-linear fashion. Observer integration may become permanent. Deputy Zaragoza's superposition state may fail to resolve correctly. Or it might break whatever this is and return everything to normal, Kepler said, unscrewing the cap on the first bottle. I'm willing to take that risk. He began pouring the solvent across the floor, across the desk, across the computer equipment that might or might not be real. The chemical smell filled the air, sharp and acrid, mixing with the electrical ozone scent that had been present since he'd entered the building. Greer watched him with those multiplying eyes, her form beginning to flicker and shift, as if the pattern that sustained her was already starting to break down. Temporal echo stores patterns, she said, and now her voice sounded almost human, almost regretful. 7 years of repetitive action creates groove in reality. But groove can be erased. Pattern can be disrupted. If you do this, way station will cease to recur. All operational memory will be lost. I will be lost. You're already lost, Kepler said, not unkindly. You're a memory of a closed facility trying to continue operations that ended 7 years ago. Whatever you are, you're not supposed to be here. He pulled out his lighter, a cheap gas station model he'd carried for 20 years despite never smoking, useful for burning evidence of illegal fireworks or lighting flares at accident scenes. The small flame seemed impossibly bright in the fluorescent-lit room, a different kind of light, a present-moment fire that existed outside the station's temporal loop. Last chance, Kepler said. Release my deputy and end this recurring operations voluntarily. Greer's form flickered more rapidly, multiple versions of her overlapping and separating. I cannot voluntarily end. I am the pattern. I am the recurrence. I am the memory of operations that defined this facility's existence. Without the pattern, I am nothing. I'm sorry, Kepler said, and meant it. Then he dropped the lighter into the pool of solvent. The flames spread with surprising speed, racing across the chemical-soaked floor in blue and yellow waves. But instead of burning like normal fire, the flames seemed to consume something else. Not the physical structure of the building, but the temporal echo itself. Where the fire touched, the impossible computer stations flickered and faded. The walls returned to dusty abandonment. The fluorescent lights went dark one by one. Greer Ellington's form began to dissolve, not burning but simply ceasing to exist, as if she were a video image being erased frame by frame. Pattern disrupted, her voice said, now coming from everywhere and nowhere. Temporal stability failing, recurring operations terminating, observer integration reversing, memory structures collapsing. 7 years of operations, 7 years of purpose, all patterns end, all recurrences cease. I am... Her voice faded to static, then to silence. The fire continued to spread, but Kepler could see that it wasn't actually consuming the building. The concrete walls remained untouched, the floor undamaged. The flames were burning through something else, something he couldn't quite see but could feel dissipating, like smoke clearing from a room. All around him, the way station was transforming. The operations room dissolved into an empty space filled with dust and debris. The computer stations vanished, leaving only marks on the floor where they might once have stood years ago. The fluorescent lights went dark permanently, and through the windows, which were once again boarded over, no light leaked at all. Kepler's radio erupted with voices. Rita from dispatch, Deputy Martinez en route from Wilcox, and most importantly, Zaragoza, sounding confused but fundamentally himself. "Sheriff, this is Zaragoza. I'm not sure what just happened. I was approaching the way station from the south, and I saw what looked like a checkpoint. And then, I don't know, there's a gap. I'm parked on the shoulder about a mile south of your position, and I can't remember the last 10 or 15 minutes. Should I be concerned? Did something happen?" Relief flooded through Kepler. "Zaragoza, what's your current status? Are you injured?" "Negative, Sheriff. I'm fine, just confused. The checkpoint I reported, it's not here anymore. Or maybe it was never here. My memory is fuzzy." "Head to my location," Kepler ordered. "And don't worry about the memory gaps. I'll explain when you get here." The flames were dying down now, having consumed whatever temporal pattern they'd been burning through. Kepler moved carefully through the darkened building, his flashlight revealing nothing but ordinary abandonment. Dusty floors, cobwebs in corners, graffiti on walls from teenagers who'd broken in years ago. The place smelled of desert dust and old concrete. No trace of the electrical ozone or chemical solvent that had been so present moments before. Outside, Kepler found his patrol unit exactly where he'd left it. The engine still running, everything normal. The way station building behind him was dark and silent, just an abandoned structure with no signs of the impossible operations he'd witnessed. If not for the fading adrenaline in his system and the vivid memory of Greer Ellington's wrong eyes, he might have convinced himself he'd imagined the entire event. Deputy Zaragoza arrived 12 minutes later, pulling his patrol unit alongside Kepler's. The younger deputy looked tired and confused, dark circles under his eyes suggesting the temporal integration had taken more out of him than he realized. "Sheriff, I need to know. Did something weird happen tonight? I've got this feeling like I experienced something important, but I can't hold on to the details. It's like trying to remember a dream after you wake up." Kepler considered how to answer. The truth was so far outside normal experience that it would sound like the ravings of someone who'd lost their grip on reality. but Zaragoza deserved honesty, or at least as much of it as Kepler could provide. Something unusual happened at the way station. The details are unclear, but I think we encountered some kind of residual phenomenon, an echo of the facility's operational past manifesting in present time. Like a haunting? Zaragoza's expression was skeptical, but not dismissive. Something like that. But it's over now. The pattern that was creating the manifestation has been disrupted. How did you disrupt it? Kepler gestured back at the dark building. Fire, or the threat of fire. The phenomenon seemed to be based on repetition and pattern. 7 years of the same activities creating a groove in reality. Introducing something that had never happened before, that wasn't part of the pattern, was enough to break it. Zaragoza was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Then he asked the question Kepler had been dreading. "Sheriff, did you see anyone inside the station? Someone in a DOT uniform, maybe? Because I have this memory that isn't quite a memory of talking to someone, a woman, I think, with eyes that were wrong somehow. But I can't tell if that's real or if my brain is just filling in gaps with nonsense." "You talked to Greer Ellington," Kepler said. "Or a version of her. She was the station supervisor before the facility closed. I think she became integrated with the temporal echo, part of the pattern that was trying to recur. Is she still in there?" Kepler looked back at the abandoned building, remembering how Greer's form had dissolved as the pattern collapsed, her final words fading into static and silence. "No. When the pattern broke, she broke with it. Whatever she was, she's gone now." Rita's voice crackled over both their radios. "Sheriff Kepler, ADOT is reporting that the power consumption at the way station has ceased. Their meters show the location has returned to 0 draw. They're still planning to send a crew to investigate, but it looks like whatever was causing the anomaly has resolved itself." "Copy that, dispatch. Deputy Zaragoza and I are securing the scene. We'll wait for the ADOT crew and provide them with a report." Kepler paused, then added, "Make a note in the log that I'm recommending this facility be demolished rather than just left abandoned. There are safety concerns that go beyond normal structural issues." "Understood, Sheriff. I'll flag it for county review." Kepler and Zaragoza spent the next 2 hours waiting for the ADOT crew to arrive, during which time they conducted a thorough search of the way station and found nothing unusual, just an old, abandoned building that had outlived its purpose. The ADOT technicians couldn't explain the power consumption anomaly and eventually attributed it to a metering error or possibly unauthorized tapping into power lines, though they couldn't find any evidence of such connections. By 3:15 a.m., everyone had left except Kepler. He stood alone in the cold desert night, looking at the dark building that had briefly become a nexus of temporal echoes and recurring patterns. He thought about Greer Ellington, or the memory construct that had borne her name and appearance, and felt a pang of something like guilt. She had been doing her job, or at least a pattern created by 7 years of doing that job, and he had erased her by disrupting the recurrence that gave her form. But then he thought about the trucks being pulled into the temporal echo, their drivers experiencing inspections that occurred outside normal time, and about Zaragoza being integrated into the checkpoint operation, existing in superposition between observer and participant. The pattern might have been created by routine operations, but it had become something dangerous, something that pulled the present into the past and confused the boundaries between what was and what had been. It was better to let it end. Kepler climbed into his patrol unit and drove away from the way station, watching in his rearview mirror as the building receded into darkness. He made it about 3 miles before his radio crackled with a voice that made his blood run cold. Greer Ellington's voice, distorted and faint but unmistakably hers. Pattern damaged but not destroyed. Temporal grooves persist. Recurrence probability reduced to 7.3% but non-zero. I am, I will be. Memory does not die easily, Sheriff Kepler. Thank you for trying to free me, even if freedom means cessation. Some patterns appreciate the opportunity to end. Then silence. And when Kepler tried to get Rita to confirm whether she'd heard the transmission, the dispatcher reported that his radio had been quiet for the past 5 minutes. No transmissions received. Kepler drove back to the county building in Bisbee as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. He would file a report, carefully worded to avoid sounding insane, recommending that the way station be demolished and the land returned to desert. He would suggest increased patrols along that stretch of Highway 191, watching for any signs of unusual activity or temporal anomalies, and he would check on Deputy Zaragoza regularly over the coming weeks, making sure the younger deputy showed no lasting effects from his brief integration into the checkpoint operation. But he would also remember Greer Ellington's final transmission, her acknowledgement that some patterns appreciate the opportunity to end, even when ending means ceasing to exist. And late at night, when he couldn't sleep, he would wonder whether he had truly disrupted the temporal echo or merely damaged it, reducing its strength but not eliminating it entirely. 7 months later, Kepler received a report from a truck driver who claimed to have been stopped at a checkpoint near the old way station on Highway 191. The driver described DOT officers who moved mechanically, a processing time that felt both too short and too long, and a nagging feeling afterward that something about the interaction hadn't been quite real. The driver couldn't pinpoint exactly what had been wrong, but the experience bothered him enough to file a report with the highway patrol. Kepler drove out to the way station location and found it exactly as he'd last seen it. Abandoned, dark, silent. But as he stood there in the desert afternoon, he thought he felt something. A faint vibration in the air like the residual hum of machinery that had been turned off, but not quite forgotten. The pattern had been disrupted, weakened, but perhaps not entirely erased. Perhaps 7 years of repetitive operations had carved a groove deep enough in reality that it would never fully smooth out, no matter how much disruption was applied. He made a note in his log and drove away, leaving the way station to its abandonment and its memories, its reduced but non-zero probability of recurrence. Some patterns, he had learned, were stronger than the actions that created them. Some grooves cut too deep to be entirely filled, and some memories refused to die easily, even when the institutions that generated them had long since closed their doors and moved on. The way station on Highway 191 remained abandoned, its windows boarded, its scale pits filled with concrete. But on certain nights, when conditions aligned in ways that defied conventional physics, when the boundary between past and present grew thin enough for patterns to bleed through, truckers reported being stopped at checkpoints that shouldn't exist, processed by officers who moved with mechanical precision, and released back into normal time with gaps in their memory and a nagging sense that something had been wrong but couldn't quite be defined. And sometimes, late at night when the highway was quiet, Sheriff Rowan Kepler would drive past the old way station and see light flickering behind those boarded windows, faint and uncertain, like a memory trying to remember itself back into existence. He never stopped on those nights, never investigated, never filed reports. Some patterns deserve the chance to fade in their own time, even if that time measured in probability percentages rather than calendar days. The recurrence continued, diminished but persistent, a ghost of operations that had once given the location purpose and identity. And Greer Ellington, or the temporal echo that bore her name, existed in those moments of recurrence, not quite alive but not entirely gone, a pattern remembering what it had been and trying, with decreasing success, to become it again. Some endings are not final. Some closures never quite seal. And some memories refuse to accept that their operational status has been changed from active to deactivated. continuing to process and inspect and verify long after the authority to do so has been officially revoked. The pattern persists. The groove remains. And on certain nights, the way station remembers.